The quiet suburb of Millfield, Pennsylvania, with its manicured lawns and friendly neighbors, was the last place anyone would expect to discover a decades-old secret that would end in tragedy. When Elaine Richardson began renovating her basement, in April 2023, she couldn't have known that a weathered shoebox hidden behind the drywall would shatter everything she thought she knew about her husband of 18 years. Inside that box lay evidence that Thomas Richardson wasn't who he claimed to be. He was Michael Harmon, a man who had been on the FBI's most wanted list since 1998. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 7 days after this discovery, both Elaine and Thomas were found dead in their home, leaving behind a community in shock and investigators piecing together a mystery spanning more than 2 decades. Millfield, Pennsylvania sits 30 miles outside of Philadelphia, a postcard-perfect suburb where property values steadily rise and neighbors still bring welcome baskets to newcomers. It was here, in a 2-story colonial on Sycamore Drive, that Thomas and Elaine Richardson built what appeared to be an idyllic life together. Thomas, 53, was a respected financial consultant who worked remotely for an investment firm in Boston. His colleagues knew him as methodical, reliable, and intensely private. Elaine, 49, ran a successful interior design business from their home, transforming local houses into showcases that frequently appeared in regional magazines. They had no children but were well liked in the community, hosting occasional dinner parties and contributing generously to local charities. They were the kind of neighbors you'd want next door, recalled Sarah Dominguez, who lived across the street. Always pleasant, never any drama. Thomas would shovel my walkway after heavy snowfalls, and Elaine brought me soup when I had pneumonia last year. What no one in Millfield knew, not even Elaine, was that Thomas Richardson had been carefully crafting his life around a monumental lie for over 20 years. In early April 2023, Elaine began renovating their basement to create a new office space. Thomas had initially resisted the idea, suggesting they convert the guest bedroom instead, but eventually relented. While Elaine was overseeing the demolition of an old wall, one of the contractors discovered a metal lockbox sealed inside the drywall, in a section Thomas had renovated himself shortly after they purchased the home in 2005. According to Elaine's sister, Jennifer Winters, Elaine mentioned the discovery during their weekly phone call. She thought it might contain old family mementos or something valuable Thomas had hidden, Jennifer later told investigators. She said Thomas acted strangely when she showed him the box, insisting he should open it privately. Elaine respected her husband's wishes, but her curiosity lingered. 3 days later, while Thomas was attending a conference in Chicago, she found the box in his home office drawer, unlocked. Inside were items that made no sense to Elaine at first. A California driver's license for someone named Michael Harmon, with Thomas's photo, credit cards in the same name, newspaper clippings from 1998 detailing a massive investment fraud that had cost retirees in Sacramento over $30 million, and a passport with stamps showing entries to Brazil, Argentina, and Canada between 1998 and 2003. Confused and increasingly alarmed, Elaine did what many would do in the digital age. She searched online for Michael Harmon Sacramento fraud. The results shattered her reality. Michael Harmon had been indicted in 1998 for orchestrating an elaborate Ponzi scheme through his investment firm, Harmon Capital. The scheme had decimated the retirement savings of over 400 victims, many of whom were elderly. Among the victims was a former judge who, after losing his entire retirement fund, died by suicide, leaving behind a note naming Harmon as responsible. Harmon had disappeared 2 days before his scheduled arraignment, vanishing with an estimated $5 million that was never recovered. The FBI had placed him on their most wanted list, where he remained as one of the Bureau's longest-running fugitive cases. The man Elaine had married in 2005, the man who had shared her bed for 18 years, was not Thomas Richardson at all. He was Michael Harmon, fugitive, alleged fraudster, and according to several victim impact statements, a monster who preyed on the elderly with calculating precision. Elaine's next actions are still being pieced together by investigators. Phone. Records show she made several calls to her sister that went unanswered. She withdrew $10,000 from their joint savings account. She contacted appointments following week. It is known with certainty that Elaine did not immediately contact authorities. Spent hours researching the Harmon case, even joining an online forum for victims of the Harmon capital fraud. Looking back, I think she was in shock, Jennifer Winters later told the Philadelphia Inquirer. Elaine was methodical. She wouldn't make a move until she had processed everything and formed a plan. Thomas, or Michael, returned from Chicago on April 15th. Security camera footage from their neighbor's doorbell captured him arriving home, carrying his overnight bag and a bouquet of lilies, Elaine's favorite flowers. He appeared relaxed, showing no signs of a man whose decades-long deception was about to implode. What happened inside the Richardson home over the next 3 days remains largely unknown. Neighbors reported nothing unusual, no shouting, no comings or goings that seemed out of ordinary. Thomas was seen walking their dog, waving to neighbors, and retrieving packages from the front porch. Elaine was spotted tending to her garden and collecting mail. They appeared, on the surface, to be going about their normal routines. On the morning of April 18th, Jennifer Winters became concerned when Elaine missed their scheduled weekly call and wasn't responding to texts. Something highly unusual for her punctual sister. After several attempts to reach either Thomas or Elaine, Jennifer called the Millfield Police Department to request a welfare check. Officer Daniel Hayes arrived at the Richardson home at approximately 2:30 p.m. His body cam footage captured what seemed like a routine check, knocking on the front door, peering through windows, and walking the perimeter of the property. Finding no response but nothing overtly suspicious, he was preparing to leave when he noticed the garage door was slightly ajar. Inside, both Thomas and Elaine Richardson were dead in their vehicle, a 2021 BMW X5. The engine was off, but the key was in the ignition. Initial reports suggested carbon monoxide poisoning, but the medical examiner would later determine that both had died from gunshot wounds to the head. A Smith & Wesson 9mm pistol, registered to Thomas Richardson, was found. In his hand, the discovery sent shockwaves through Millfield. As news crews descended on Sycamore Drive, neighbors struggled to reconcile the couple they thought they knew with the gruesome scene and emerging revelations about Thomas's true identity. It's like finding out your whole neighborhood was built on quicksand, said Robert Carson, who had known the couple for over a decade. If Thomas Richardson could be someone else entirely, what else don't we know about the people we see every day? The FBI quickly took over the investigation, working with local authorities to piece together the complex timeline of Michael Harmon's transformation into Thomas Richardson. Special Agent Cassandra Mitchell, who had inherited the dormant Harmon case just 2 years earlier, arrived from the Sacramento field office within hours of the bodies being discovered. This case represents one of the longest and most successful identity concealments we've encountered, Mitchell told reporters at a press conference held 2 days after the discovery. Harmon didn't just change his name. He created an entirely new personal history, professional credentials, and social circle. He maintained this deception for over 2 decades, even from his spouse. As investigators combed through the Richardson home, they discovered a hidden safe in the attic containing over $2 million in cash, multiple sets of identification documents in various names, and detailed notes on how to establish new identities, suggesting that Harmon had been prepared to disappear again, if necessary. They also found Elaine's journal, with a final entry dated April 17th, the day before the bodies were discovered. The contents of this entry have not been made public, but sources close to the investigation described it as heartbreaking and said it provided crucial insights into Elaine's state of mind after discovering her husband's true identity. The victims of the original Harmon Capital fraud, now elderly if still alive, began receiving calls from the FBI. For many, the news reopened wounds that had never fully healed. As investigators delved deeper into the double tragedy on Sycamore Drive, the carefully constructed life of Thomas Richardson began to unravel like a sweater caught on a nail. FBI forensic accountants discovered that the financial consulting firm Thomas claimed to work for had no record of him on their payroll. Instead, he had created an elaborate shell company called Richardson Advisory Services that appeared to legitimate businesses as a subsidiary of larger firms. Through this entity, he laundered portions of the money he had stolen back in 1998, creating the illusion of a steady income. It was financial sleight of hand at its most sophisticated, explained forensic accountant Melissa Thorpe. He created just enough of a paper trail to avoid suspicion, but not enough to be traceable. His tax returns were immaculate. He even deliberately overpaid some years to avoid IRS scrutiny. Harmon's transformation into Thomas Richardson began almost immediately after he fled Sacramento in 1998. According to travel records recovered from various sources, he first fled to Brazil, where he stayed for approximately 8 months in Rio de Janeiro under the name David Collier. From there, he moved to Argentina, where he began constructing the Thomas Richardson identity, purchasing forged documents from sources in the criminal underground of Buenos Aires. By 2003, the Thomas Richardson identity was fully formed, complete, with a manufactured background, a business degree from Northwestern University, which had no record of his attendance, a previous career at a financial firm that had since been acquired and whose records were conveniently difficult to verify, and a tragic backstory of being orphaned at a young age, explaining his lack of family connections. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. What investigators found particularly striking was the calculated way Harmon had selected Millfield as his hideout. The suburb was affluent enough to provide cover for his supposed wealth, but small enough that he could become a recognized figure in the community, making him less likely to draw suspicion. It was also just far enough from major FBI field offices to reduce the chances of accidental recognition. Fugitives typically make one of two choices, explained criminal psychologist Dr. Andrea Warren, who consulted on the case. They either disappear completely into anonymity in a large city, or they integrate so thoroughly into a small community that they become fixtures, hiding in plain sight. Harmon chose the latter approach and executed it with remarkable precision. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of Harmon's deception was his selection of Elaine as a spouse. Investigators discovered emails on Harmon's computer from 2004, when he first met Elaine at a charity fundraiser in Philadelphia. In messages to an unidentified correspondent, he described her as perfect cover and socially connected enough to be useful, but not scrutinizing. It appears that, at least initially, the marriage was part of his cover, said Special Agent Mitchell. What we don't know is if his feelings evolved over time, Long-term deep-cover fugitives often begin to inhabit their false identities so completely that the lines blur between deception and authentic life. Elaine's family and friends painted a picture of a woman who was intelligent, accomplished, and fiercely loyal. A graduate of Penn State with a master's degree in interior design from Drexel University, she had built her business from scratch after working for several prestigious firms in Philadelphia. Friends described her as perceptive and detail-oriented, qualities that made the 18 years of deception all the more remarkable. Elaine wasn't naive, insisted her college roommate and lifelong friend, Meredith Calloway. She was the person who could tell when someone was lying about the smallest thing. The fact that she never suspected Thomas suggests how masterful his deception must have been. Or perhaps, investigators theorized, she had chosen not to see what was before her. The couple's neighbor, retired psychologist Walter Bennett, suggested another possibility. Sometimes we don't see what we don't want to see, especially when it comes to those we love. The human mind is remarkably adept at filtering information that threatens our sense of security. As the FBI reconstructed the timeline of those final days, a clearer picture emerged of Elaine's actions after discovering her husband's true identity. Digital forensics revealed that she had contacted 3 of Harmon's victims through the online forum, including the daughter of the judge who had taken his life after losing his savings. She had also begun transferring assets from their joint accounts to accounts solely in her name, nearly $400,000 over 3 days. Most significantly, investigators found drafts of an email to the FBI's tip line on her computer. The most recent version, edited just hours before her death, detailed everything she had discovered about her husband's true identity and included scanned images of the documents from the hidden lockbox. The email was never sent. In a particularly haunting, Harmon didn't just change his name. He created an entirely new personal history, professional credentials, and social circle. He maintained this deception for over 2 decades, even from his spouse. As investigators combed through the Richardson home, they discovered a hidden safe in the attic containing over $2 million in cash, multiple sets of identification documents in various names, and detailed notes on how to establish new identities, suggesting that Harmon had been prepared to disappear again if necessary. They also found Elaine's journal, with a final entry dated April 17th, the day before the bodies were discovered. The contents of this entry have not been made public, but sources close to the investigation described it as heartbreaking and said it provided crucial insights into Elaine's state of mind after discovering her husband's true identity. The victims of the original Harmon Capital fraud, now elderly if still alive, began receiving calls from the FBI. For many, the news reopened wounds that had never fully healed. As investigators delved deeper into the double tragedy on Sycamore Drive, the carefully constructed life of Thomas Richardson began to unravel like a sweater caught on a nail. FBI forensic accountants discovered that the financial consulting firm Thomas claimed to work for had no record of him on their payroll. Instead, he had created an elaborate shell company called Richardson Advisory Services that appeared to legitimate businesses as a subsidiary of larger firms. Through this entity, he laundered portions of the money he had stolen back in 1998, creating the illusion of a steady income. It was financial sleight of hand at its most sophisticated, explained forensic accountant Melissa Thorpe. He created just enough of a paper trail to avoid suspicion, but not enough to be traceable. His tax returns were immaculate. He even deliberately overpaid some years to avoid IRS scrutiny. Harmon's transformation into Thomas Richardson began almost immediately after he fled Sacramento in 1998. According to travel records recovered from various sources, he first fled to Brazil, where he stayed for approximately 8 months in Rio de Janeiro under the name David Collier. From there, he moved to Argentina, where he began constructing the Thomas Richardson identity, purchasing forged documents from sources in the criminal underground of Buenos Aires. By 2003, the Thomas Richardson identity was fully formed, complete. With a manufactured background, a business degree from Northwestern University, which had no record of his attendance, a previous career at a financial firm that had since been acquired and whose records were conveniently difficult to verify, and a tragic backstory of being orphaned at a young age, explaining his lack of family connections. Detail: phone records showed that Elaine had made a 47-minute call to the Sacramento District Attorney's Office on April 17th, though the content of that conversation remains confidential as part of the ongoing investigation. "We believe Mrs. Richardson was preparing to turn her husband in," stated Agent Mitchell. "The evidence suggests she was methodically gathering information while simultaneously extracting herself financially from their shared life." What remains unclear is whether Thomas Michael realized what his wife was doing. The home's security system had been disabled on April 17th, something the Richardson household had never done, according to system logs dating back to installation. Additionally, neighbors reported seeing Thomas making multiple trips to and from the house, carrying what appeared to be file boxes to his car, only to return them to the house hours later. "He was frantic that day," recalled Aaron Murphy, who lived 2 doors down. "I waved at him while walking my dog, and he didn't even seem to see me, completely unlike his usual friendly self." The autopsy reports added another layer of complexity to the case. While initial reports suggested murder-suicide, with Thomas shooting Elaine before turning the gun on himself, forensic evidence painted a more ambiguous picture. Both Thomas and Elaine had gunshot residue on their hands. The angle of Thomas's wound was unusual for self-infliction, and toxicology reports showed both had consumed the same sedative medication shortly before death, medication prescribed to neither of them. "We cannot conclusively determine who fired, which shot," admitted County Medical Examiner Dr. Vanessa Rodriguez. "The physical evidence allows for multiple scenarios, including the possibility that both wounds were self-inflicted after a mutual decision." This ambiguity led investigators to a third theory, a suicide pact. Elaine's journal, recovered from her bedside table, contained entries from those final days that suggested she was grappling with how to reconcile her love for the man she had known with the criminal he had been. "How do you unlove someone?" she wrote on April 16th. "Is Thomas real, or was he always just a mask worn by Michael? And if I love the mask, what does that say about me?" While the journal didn't explicitly mention plans for suicide, her final entry included a line that investigators found telling, "There is no path forward that doesn't lead through unbearable pain." Perhaps the kindest thing we can do for each other now is to end the suffering before it truly begins. As the investigation into the deaths continued, attention turned to the original crimes that had set the tragic sequence in motion. The Harmon capital fraud of 1998 had been one of the largest investment scams in Sacramento history at that time. Operating before the Madoff scandal had made such schemes household knowledge, Harmon had promised consistent 12% returns to investors through proprietary trading algorithms and exclusive market access. Curtis Watson, the lead investigator on the original case who had since retired, was brought in as a consultant. Harmon was particularly insidious because he specifically targeted people who had worked hard their entire lives and were planning for retirement, Watson explained. He cultivated relationships with community leaders, sponsored local events, donated to charities, all to create an aura of trustworthiness. Among the victims was federal judge Raymond Atherton, who had invested his entire retirement portfolio of $1.8 million with Harman Capital after meeting Michael at a judicial conference where Harman was a featured speaker on financial planning. When the scheme collapsed and Judge Atherton learned his life savings had vanished, he took his own life, leaving behind a note that read, in part, "A life without dignity or means at my age is not a life I choose to live. Michael Harman has taken everything." Judge Atherton's daughter, Catherine Atherton Wells, now 53, had spent the past 2 decades advocating for her father's case and maintaining a website dedicated to finding Harman. When the FBI informed her of Harman's discovery and death, her reaction was complex. "There's no closure," she told the Sacramento Bee. "He lived a comfortable life for 20 years, while my father's was cut short. He had love, community, respect, all built on stolen money and stolen lives. And now, with his death, there will never be true accountability. For the victims who were still alive, the news reopened old wounds." Bernard and Helen Kapowski, now in their 80s, had lost $350,000 to Harman Capital, money they had planned to use for retirement and their grandchildren's college education. "Finding out he's been living this double life all these years while we struggled to rebuild is infuriating," said Bernard. "Helen had to keep working as a school secretary until she was 75 because of what he did. We'll never get those years back." The discovery of over $2 million in cash in the Richardson home offered some prospect of restitution. The FBI also uncovered evidence of additional accounts in offshore banks, potentially holding millions more of the stolen funds. The Department of Justice announced that any recovered money would be distributed to the original victims or their estates, according to the proportion of their losses. As for the home on Sycamore Drive, it stood empty, becoming an unintentional monument to deception. Curious onlookers drove by slowly, some even taking photos, much to the dismay of neighbors who were trying to process their own sense of betrayal and loss. "We're mourning 2 different things," explained Sarah Dominguez. "We're mourning Elaine, who was genuinely part of our community, and we're mourning our own naivety, the belief that we knew our neighbors, that our community was safe and transparent." The case also raised uncomfortable questions about identity in modern America. Despite advances in identification, verification, and the interconnectedness of digital records, Harman had managed to live completely off the radar of law enforcement for over 2 decades. "This case exposes vulnerabilities in our systems," admitted FBI Assistant Director Nathan Rodriguez in a press conference. In the late 1990s, creating a new identity was easier than it would be today, but the fact that Harman maintained this deception well into the era of advanced digital verification is concerning. Security experts pointed to Harman's case as evidence of what they called identity laundering, the process by which false identities become increasingly legitimate over time through accumulated documentation, credit history, and social presence. Once you've established a baseline of legitimate documentation and maintained it for a few years, each new credential becomes easier to obtain, explained Kyle Bradshaw, a consultant on identity security. A driver's license leads to a passport, which leads to financial accounts, which lead to more complex credentials. The initial fraud becomes buried under layers of seemingly legitimate activity. For the residents of Millfield, the case prompted uncomfortable self-reflection. The community had embraced Thomas and Elaine Richardson without question, accepting the narrative they presented at face value. Local officials organized community meetings to help residents process the events and discuss ways to strengthen community bonds without surrendering to paranoia. "We can't let this destroy the trust that makes communities like ours function," urged Mayor Denise Wilson at one such gathering. But perhaps we can be more authentically connected to each other, more willing to be vulnerable about our real lives, rather than presenting perfect facades. As spring turned to summer in Millfield, the Richardson house was finally sold to a young family from Philadelphia. The new owners completely renovated the property, removing all traces of its former occupants. Neighbors brought welcome baskets and introduced themselves, just as they had done for Thomas and Elaine years earlier, but perhaps with a bit more caution in their smiles, a bit more reservation in their welcomes. For Jennifer Winters, Elaine's sister, the loss remained raw and complex. She established a scholarship in Elaine's name at Drexel University's design program and became an advocate for support services for family members of those involved in financial crimes. Elaine was a victim too, Jennifer insisted. She lost not only her life, but her entire sense of reality in those final days. I want people to remember her for the talented, kind person she was, not just as the wife of a fugitive. As the one-year anniversary of the deaths approached, many questions remained unanswered. The FBI continued to trace Harmon's movements during his years as a fugitive, identifying at least 3 other identities he had used before settling on Thomas Richardson. They discovered evidence that he had returned to Sacramento at least once in 2010, possibly to observe the community he had devastated, a psychological pattern not uncommon among certain types of white-collar criminals. The full truth of those final days in the Richardson household may never be known. Did Thomas realize Elaine had discovered his secret? Did he confess everything when confronted? Was their final act one of mutual decision, or did one make the choice for both? The physical evidence allowed for multiple interpretations, and the dead kept their secrets. What remained clear was the devastating ripple effect of deception, how one man's fraud had created waves of destruction that continued decades later, claiming not only his life and the life of his unwitting wife, but damaging countless others along the way. This case isn't just about financial fraud or a fugitive's escape, reflected Agent Mitchell as the investigation wound down. It's about the human cost of living with lies, both for those who tell them and those who, whether they know it or not, are living within them. The digital ghost of Michael Harmon continued to yield secrets long after his physical body was laid to rest. 6 months into the investigation, FBI cybersecurity specialists discovered an encrypted hard drive hidden in a false bottom of a gun safe in the garage, a hiding spot so ingenious that it had been missed during the initial search of the property. Breaking the encryption took another 3 months, revealing a trove of documents that shed new light on Harmon's years as a fugitive and raised disturbing questions about whether his crimes had truly ended when he became Thomas Richardson. The drive contained meticulous records of Harmon's financial movements from 1998 to 2023, including the complex network of offshore accounts where he had hidden the majority of the $5 million stolen from his Sacramento victims. These records revealed that the $2 million found in the home was merely a contingency fund, the tip of a much larger financial iceberg. We've identified at least $12 million in assets that can be traced back to the original fraud, announced U.S. Attorney Caroline Miles at a press conference in Philadelphia. This includes properties in Brazil, investment accounts in the Cayman Islands, and a significant portfolio of cryptocurrency acquired as early as 2011. Most surprisingly, the record showed that Harmon had continued to operate investment scams on a smaller scale throughout his years as Thomas Richardson, targeting wealthy individuals in cities far from Millfield, careful never to fish in his own pond. Using his professional network as a financial consultant, he had persuaded at least 11 high-net-worth individuals to invest in exclusive opportunities that were, in reality, sophisticated Ponzi schemes. These operations had netted an additional $3.7 million over 15 years. He couldn't stop, explained Dr. Warren, the criminal psychologist. For individuals like Harmon, the thrill isn't just in the money, it's in the manipulation, the feeling of intellectual superiority that comes from successfully deceiving others. It becomes an addiction. Among the files were detailed psychological profiles of potential victims, including photographs taken surreptitiously, notes on their family, relationships, spending habits, and vulnerabilities that could be exploited. Harmon had created a scientific approach to predation, refining his techniques with each new target. "It's one of the most calculated approaches to fraud I've ever seen," admitted Agent Mitchell. He treated finding victims like a corporate recruitment process, complete with screening criteria, risk assessment, and projected return on investment. The discovery of this ongoing criminal enterprise raised painful questions about Elaine's knowledge or involvement. Had she been completely in the dark, or had she suspected something was amiss with her husband's business dealings? Financial records showed that while Elaine had access to their joint accounts, which contained legitimately earned money from her interior design business and Thomas's consulting work, she had no access to or apparent knowledge of the accounts containing ill-gotten gains. "We found no evidence that Elaine Richardson was aware of or participated in any of her husband's fraudulent activities," U.S. Attorney Miles emphasized. "All indications suggest she was another victim of his deception, albeit in a different way than his financial targets." This assessment was supported by emails recovered from Elaine's cloud accounts, which showed her growing concern about Thomas's frequent business trips to cities where he claimed to have clients. In one exchange with her sister from 2021, she wrote, "Thomas is in Chicago again this month, third time this year. When I ask about his clients there, he's uncharacteristically vague. Probably nothing, but sometimes I wonder if there's another woman. Isn't that ridiculous after all these years?" Jennifer Winters confirmed that Elaine had occasionally expressed such concerns, but had always dismissed them. She would laugh it off, saying Thomas was too boring and predictable to have an affair, Jennifer recalled. The sad irony is that she was worrying about the wrong kind of betrayal entirely. The encrypted drive also contained a folder labeled Exit Strategies. Detailed plans for disappearing yet again if Thomas Richardson's identity was ever compromised. These plans included prepared documentation for 3 additional identities, with driver's licenses, social security cards, birth certificates, and passports all professionally forged and ready for use. Each new identity came with a complete backstory, professional credentials, and financial accounts already established in the name. Most chillingly, the plans were designed for a solo escape. There was no provision for Elaine to accompany him in any of these scenarios. When a man prepares 3 different escape plans that don't include his wife of 18 years, it tells you everything about the true nature of that relationship, noted Dr. Warren. She was always expendable to him, a component of his cover rather than a true partner. Yet the complexity of human relationships defies simple categorization. Among Harmon's personal files was a journal he had kept sporadically over the years. While much of it focused on his schemes and strategies, certain entries revealed moments of genuine connection with Elaine and occasional guilt about his deception. In an entry from 2012, he wrote, "7 years of marriage today. E planned a surprise weekend in the Poconos. She remembered I once mentioned wanting to try fly fishing. Sometimes I forget this isn't real, which is dangerous. But today, watching her laugh as she failed miserably at casting, I wished, just for a moment, that Thomas was real and Michael was fiction." Such glimpses into Harmon's internal life suggested a man divided against himself, capable of genuine emotion, yet ultimately unwilling to surrender the thrill of deception and the freedom that came with knowing he could disappear at any moment. As the investigation expanded to include Harmon's more recent victims, a more complete picture of his methodology emerged. Unlike his Sacramento-era fraud, which had targeted primarily retirees, his later schemes focused on newly wealthy entrepreneurs and professionals, people with significant assets but limited financial sophistication. One such victim was Derek Patterson, a software developer from Seattle who had sold his startup for $4.2 million in 2018. Patterson had met Thomas Richardson at a technology investment conference in Boston, where Thomas had presented himself as a consultant specializing in wealth management for tech entrepreneurs. He knew exactly which buttons to push, Patterson recalled. He talked about how traditional financial advisors don't understand the tech sector, how they apply outdated models to new economic wealth. He positioned himself as the insider who could bridge those worlds. Over 18 months, Patterson invested $1.8 million in what Thomas described as a specialized fund for disruptive technologies, too cutting edge for public markets. The returns initially seemed impressive, with statements showing 14% annualized growth. It was only when Patterson attempted to liquidate a portion of his investment to purchase a home that the scheme began to unravel. He always had a plausible reason why I couldn't withdraw that specific amount at that specific time. Market timing issues, penalty periods, liquidity constraints, Patterson explained. I started to get suspicious, but then he'd send a partial payment to reassure me, always with documentation that looked impeccable. Patterson had been in the process of hiring a forensic accountant to investigate the fund when news broke of Thomas Richardson's true identity and death. I saw his picture on the news and nearly dropped my phone. I'd been having dinner with this man, sharing personal stories. He'd met my fiancée, advised me on my wedding budget. The level of betrayal is hard to process. For Patterson and the other recent victims, the recovered funds offered some consolation, though the emotional damage was less easily repaired. It's not just about the money, Patterson reflected. It's about feeling like your judgment is fundamentally flawed, like you can't trust your own ability to assess someone's character. As investigators work to unwind Harmon's financial web and provide restitution to victims both old and new, attention turned to the legal implications for others in his orbit. While Elaine appeared to be innocent of involvement in her husband's schemes, questions arose about professionals who had facilitated Thomas Richardson's business activities. Of particular interest was Stanford Wheeler, an attorney in Philadelphia, who had handled the formation of Richardson Advisory Services and other business entities used in the fraud. Wheeler had also assisted with real estate transactions and other legal matters for the Richardsons over a 15-year period. We're examining the level of due diligence performed by several professionals who provided services to Mr. Richardson, stated U.S. Attorney Miles. The question is whether they followed required protocols for client verification and suspicious activity reporting. Wheeler, through his attorney, maintained that he had no knowledge of Richardson's true identity or fraudulent activities. My client performed standard verification procedures appropriate for the time periods in question and had no reason to suspect his client was anyone other than who he claimed to be, the statement read. The investigation also focused on how Harmon had obtained his forged documentation. The sophistication of the identity papers found in his possession suggested connections to organized criminal networks specializing in such services. Metadata from files on the encrypted drive led investigators to an operation based in Paraguay that provided high-quality forged documents to clients worldwide. A joint operation between the FBI, Interpol, and Paraguayan authorities resulted in the arrest of 4 individuals connected to the forgery ring. This organization has been providing new identities to fugitives, money launderers, and other criminals for over 2 decades, explained FBI International Operations Division Chief Ryan Morgan. The Harmon case has helped us dismantle one of the most sophisticated document forgery operations we've encountered. While the criminal investigations expanded outward from the events on Sycamore Drive, the human toll of Harmon's deception continued to reveal itself in more intimate ways. In December 2023, 8 months after the deaths, Elaine's friend Meredith Calloway discovered a package in her mailbox, sent via private courier with no return address. Inside was a letter from Elaine, apparently mailed through a delayed delivery service in the days before her death. The 8-page handwritten letter detailed her discovery of Thomas's true identity, her emotional turmoil, and her decision-making process during those final days. "I've spent every waking hour since finding that box trying to reconcile the man. I've loved for 18 years with the criminal he was before," Elaine wrote. "I've asked myself 1,000 times, was any of it real? The anniversary trips, the way he nursed me through pneumonia last year, the inside jokes, the life we built, was it all just an elaborate performance?" The letter confirmed what investigators had suspected. Elaine had been preparing to turn Thomas in, but had wanted to gather as much evidence as possible first, both to ensure he would face justice and to understand for herself the full scope of his deception. "I keep thinking about his victims," she wrote, "people who lost everything because they trusted him, just as I did. I can't be complicit in that, even through silence, but I also can't pretend I'm not devastated. How do you grieve for someone who never existed?" Most significantly, the letter addressed the circumstances of their deaths, though in terms that remained somewhat ambiguous. "Thomas found me packing yesterday. The moment our eyes met, I knew that he knew. There was a strange relief in that moment. Finally, no more lies between us. We talked through the night, really talked perhaps for the first time. He told me everything. About Sacramento, about the judge who took his life, about the escape and the years before we met." According to Elaine's account, Thomas had offered to turn himself in, claiming he would confess to everything if she would visit him in prison. "He says he loves me, that it began as convenience but became real. I want to believe him. Part of me does, but another part wonders if this is just another manipulation. If I agree, will he really surrender or disappear again, leaving me behind to face questions I can't answer?" The letter ended without clearly stating her intentions, only that she and Thomas had reached an understanding about what needs to happen next. The final lines read, "I don't know if I'll ever be able to forgive him, Meredith, but I understand. Now that forgiveness isn't what matters most, it's truth. And whatever happens next, at least we're finally living in truth, however painful it might be." Calloway shared the letter with investigators, but requested privacy regarding its full contents. It was Elaine's final communication, her attempt to explain a situation that defies easy explanation, she told reporters. "I think she would want people to know that she faced this terrible revelation with the same grace and integrity she brought to everything in her life." The final mystery of what transpired in the hours between Elaine writing that letter and the couple being found dead remained unsolved in any definitive sense. The physical evidence allowed for multiple scenarios, and in the absence of witnesses, certainty proves elusive. Based on all available evidence, we believe that after confronting her husband and learning the full extent of his crimes, Mrs. Richardson agreed to a mutual suicide pact, concluded the final FBI report on the deaths. The evidence suggests Mr. Harmon realized his decades of deception were about to end and chose death over imprisonment. Whether Mrs. Richardson's participation was entirely voluntary or influenced by manipulation remains unknown. Some found this conclusion unsatisfying, arguing that it failed to account for the complexity of coercive control and psychological manipulation that might have been at play. Catherine Atherton Wells, the daughter of the judge who had taken his life after being victimized by Harmon, became an outspoken advocate for considering Elaine another casualty of Harmon's crimes rather than a willing participant in the final act. When a person has been living with a master manipulator for 18 years, their ability to make truly free choices becomes compromised, she argued. I believe Elaine Richardson was murdered, if not physically by Harmon's hand, then through the psychological destruction of her reality that left her seeing no way forward. Others, including Jennifer Winters, believed the murder-suicide theory, failed to credit Elaine's agency and strength of character. My sister was not someone who would take her own life out of despair, Jennifer insisted. If she made that choice, it was a rational decision based on a clear-eyed assessment of her situation. I believe she chose to ensure Harmon couldn't escape. Justice again, even if it meant sacrificing herself. The ambiguity of the case's conclusion left space for broader conversations about identity, deception, and the foundations of human connection. Psychologists, ethicists, and relationship experts found in the Richardson case a compelling example of how trust functions as the invisible architecture of our social lives, rarely noticed until it collapses. The Richardson case forces us to confront uncomfortable questions, noted Dr. Simone Harper, author of Authentic Selves in a Digital Age, which featured a chapter on the case. How well can we truly know another person? What parts of ourselves do we reveal and conceal in our closest relationships? And perhaps most disturbingly, how would we know if the people we love are not who they claim to be? For the residents of Millfield, these questions were far from academic. The community that had prided itself on its closeness and security found itself grappling with a new awareness of the limits of neighborly knowledge. The local paper ran a series titled After Richardson, Rebuilding Trust, featuring community conversations about balancing openness with appropriate boundaries. We can't let one man's deception destroy what makes this community special, urged Pastor Leanne Morgan of Millfield Community Church during one such forum. But perhaps we can move toward a more authentic way of knowing each other, one that acknowledges our imperfections and struggles rather than maintaining facades of perfection. On the first anniversary of the deaths, a small memorial garden was planted in Millfield's Central Park, not specifically dedicated to the Richardsons, but to all those whose lives have been affected by deception and loss. The garden featured a sculpture of a shattered mirror being reassembled, pieces forming a new whole that reflected light in unexpected ways. The plaque beside it bore a quote from Elaine's journal, shared by her sister. "Truth, however painful, is the only solid ground on which to build a life. Everything else is shifting sand." As for the $15.7 million eventually recovered from Harmon's various accounts and investments, the Department of Justice established a victim compensation fund. The original Sacramento victims received priority, with most recovering about 85% of their initial losses, though as many pointed out, this did nothing to restore the years lost or the opportunities missed. Judge Atherton's estate received full restitution plus interest, with Catherine Atherton Wells using a portion to establish a foundation, providing support services to elderly victims of financial fraud. "My father isn't here to see justice done," she said at the foundation's launch, "but I like to think he would find some meaning in knowing his experience is helping protect others." The most recent victims of Thomas Richardson's schemes received full restitution, their losses having been more completely documented and their investments more readily traceable. A small portion of the recovered funds, approximately $500,000, represented Elaine's legitimate earnings from her interior design business that had been commingled with Harmon's money. After lengthy legal proceedings, this amount was released to Jennifer Winters, who used it to establish the Elaine Richardson Scholarship for Ethical Business Practices at Drexel University. ensuring that her sister's name would be associated with integrity rather than deception. In the end, the story of Thomas and Elaine Richardson, or rather, of Michael Harmon and the woman who unwittingly married a fiction, offered no neat conclusions, no satisfying closure for those caught in its web. It remained a stark reminder of how vulnerable we all are to deception, how desperately we wish to believe in the reality of the connections we form, and how devastating the consequences can be when those foundations prove false. As Agent Mitchell reflected in her final interview before being reassigned, this case isn't just about white-collar crime or fugitive apprehension. It's about the human need for truth in our most intimate relationships and the terrible price paid when that truth is corrupted. Michael Harmon stole more than money. He stole trust, security, and ultimately lives. 18 months after the deaths on Sycamore Drive, as public interest in the case began to wane, a startling development reignited national attention. A storage facility in Camden, New Jersey, rented under yet another alias connected to Michael Harmon, was discovered after the automated payments failed.
Unit contain 23
Recordings and personal items that Harmon had preserved from different phases of his life, including his time before the Sacramento fraud, his years as a fugitive, and his life as Thomas Richardson. It was essentially a museum of deception, described Special Agent Larissa Chen, who led the processing of the storage unit's contents. We've encountered criminals who keep trophies before, but nothing this extensive or methodically catalogued. It wasn't just records he needed to maintain his false identities. It was a comprehensive chronicle of his life's work, preserved as if for posterity. Most significantly, the storage unit contained a 347-page manuscript titled The Art of Becoming, a memoir of multiple lives. The document, written in Harmon's distinctive prose style but never published, detailed his transformation from a middle-class child in Bakersfield, California, to the architect of multiple identities and financial schemes. The manuscript revealed aspects of Harmon's early life that had never been uncovered during previous investigations. Born Kevin Matthew Pearson in 1970, he had shown early signs of exceptional intelligence coupled with troubling behavioral patterns. School records included in the storage unit indicated he had been evaluated for sociopathic tendencies at age 15, after manipulating classmates into an elaborate cheating ring that earned him substantial payments but resulted in several students being expelled. Even as a teenager, he understood how to exploit others' weaknesses while insulating himself from consequences, noted Dr. Warren after reviewing the newly discovered materials. The psychological evaluations from his youth show classic patterns of superficial charm, pathological lying, and a complete lack of empathy, all masked by extraordinary intelligence and social adaptability. The manuscript detailed how Kevin had first experimented with identity manipulation during college at UC San Diego, creating a fictional graduate student persona to gain access to research facilities and academic resources not available to undergraduates. This early success in deception appeared to have been formative, convincing him of both his exceptional abilities and the fundamental gullibility of institutions and individuals. After college, according to his own account, he had worked briefly in legitimate financial services before realizing that the true wealth was not in serving the system, but in exploiting its gaps. His first significant fraud had been a relatively small investment scheme in San Diego that netted approximately $400,000. money he used to create his first comprehensive false identity as Michael Harmon. "I chose the name for its solid, trustworthy sound," he wrote. "Research shows that certain names convey reliability and competence. Michael consistently ranks among the most trusted male names in America." Harmon suggests harmony, balance, qualities investors seek in financial advisors. The most disturbing revelation from the manuscript was that the Sacramento fraud, the crime for which he had been indicted and fled, was not his first major operation. Before establishing Harmon Capital in Sacramento, he had run similar schemes in Denver and Phoenix, each time disappearing before authorities could build a case, and each time emerging elsewhere with a refined approach and a new identity. "Sacramento was my magnum opus," he wrote with evident pride. "The perfect balance of scale and sustainability. I could have continued indefinitely if not for the judge's unfortunate decision. His suicide created a level of scrutiny that made continuation untenable. The casual dismissal of Judge Atherton's suicide as an unfortunate decision that had inconvenienced his operations shocked even veteran investigators. The complete absence of remorse or human empathy in his writing is chilling," remarked U.S. Attorney Miles after reviewing excerpts from the manuscript. "He discusses ruined lives and deaths as if they were minor setbacks in a business plan. Perhaps most revealing were the sections addressing his marriage to Elaine, far from the emerging narrative that he might have developed genuine feelings. For her over time, the manuscript presented a much colder calculation. The selection of a spouse is the most critical decision for long-term identity maintenance," he wrote. "The ideal candidate provides social legitimacy, access to expanded networks, and a convincing cover story while requiring minimal emotional investment. E offered the perfect combination, socially connected but not overly inquisitive, accomplished, enough to be useful but not so successful as to overshadow my constructed persona, and most importantly, psychologically predisposed to trust due to her family background." This assessment referred to what Harmon had apparently learned during their courtship, that Elaine's father had abandoned the family when she was 12, creating what Harmon described as a textbook case for attachment issues that would make her simultaneously crave stability and fear abandonment, a psychological profile ideal for manipulation. When Jennifer Winters was informed of these passages, her response was one of controlled fury. "He studied my sister like she was a specimen, looking for weaknesses he could exploit," she told investigators. "The calculated nature of it, selecting her for psychological vulnerabilities created by childhood trauma. It's beyond cruel. It's monstrous." The manuscript also addressed Harmon's contingency plans in case his Thomas Richardson identity was ever compromised. He had established exit protocols that included 3 fully developed alternative identities, emergency funds in 5 countries, and prepared explanations for his disappearance, ranging from business emergencies to medical crises. Most chillingly, the manuscript included a section titled "Spousal Contingencies" that outlined several scenarios for handling Elaine if his true identity were discovered. These ranged from simply abandoning her without explanation to more sinister options if she threatened to expose him. "Emotional leverage remains the most effective tool," he wrote. "The combination of sunk cost fallacy and fear of public humiliation would likely prevent immediate reporting to authorities. However, preparation for more definitive measures remains prudent." While the manuscript didn't explicitly mention murder-suicide as one of these definitive measures, the implication was clear enough to cause investigators to revisit their conclusions about the deaths. The discovery prompted the FBI to officially reclassify the case from undetermined circumstances to homicide-suicide, with Elaine listed as the victim and Harmon as the perpetrator. Based on new evidence, we now believe with high confidence that Michael Harmon murdered Elaine Richardson and then took his own life, stated the updated FBI report. The recovered manuscript demonstrates premeditation and suggests he had long considered this option if his identity was compromised. Beyond the revelations about Harmon himself, the storage unit contained evidence that forced authorities to expand their investigation to include potential accomplices. Documents indicated that Harmon had not operated entirely alone, as previously believed, but had maintained connections with a network of specialized professionals who facilitated various aspects of his schemes and identity changes. These included a banker in Luxembourg who had helped hide the Sacramento funds, a document forger in Paraguay who had created his various identity papers, and most surprisingly, a private investigator in Philadelphia who had performed background checks on potential victims, including Elaine, before their marriage. Harmon operated what amounted to a personal criminal enterprise, explained FBI White-Collar Crime Division Chief Teresa Lohman. While he was the mastermind and primary beneficiary, he enlisted specialists for specific functions, compartmentalizing knowledge, so no single accomplice understood the full scope of his activities. The investigation into these accomplices led to federal indictments against 7 individuals across 4 countries. The private investigator, Maxwell Donovan, became a key cooperating witness, providing crucial details about Harmon's methods in exchange for a reduced sentence. "Harmon was the most meticulous client I ever had," Donovan testified. "He wanted to know everything about a person, not just financial information, but psychological profiles, family dynamics, personal tragedies, health issues, anything that might create vulnerability or need that he could exploit." According to Donovan, Harmon had commissioned a comprehensive background investigation on Elaine before pursuing a relationship with her. The 80-page report had included details on her father's abandonment, her financial status, her close relationship with her sister, and even psychological assessments based on interviews with her former colleagues, conducted under false pretenses. He approached romantic relationships like corporate mergers, Donovan explained. Complete due diligence, risk assessment, and strategic planning. "I knew he was unusual, but I never realized the extent of his criminal activities. I thought he was just an eccentric businessman with trust issues." The storage unit also contained journals that Harmon had kept throughout his years as Thomas Richardson, more candid and less performative than the memoir he seemed to have been preparing for eventual publication. These private writings revealed moments of unexpected vulnerability and self-awareness that complicated the picture of a man seemingly incapable of genuine human connection. In one entry from 2015, during a period when Elaine was recovering from surgery, he wrote, "Spent the night in the hospital chair again. Nurses offered a cot, but I need to be able to see her breathing. Strange to realize how accustomed I've become to her presence. When she was under anesthesia, her face completely relaxed. I didn't recognize her for a moment. Wondered if that's how she would look at me if she ever saw the real me, like I was a stranger." Such glimpses of humanity, however fleeting, suggested a man at war with his own nature, capable of recognizing authentic human connection, but ultimately unwilling or unable to choose it over the thrill of manipulation and control. Dr. Warren, after reviewing the complete collection of journals, offered a nuanced assessment. "What we see in these private writings is not so much a sociopath incapable of human feeling, but rather someone who experiences connections transiently, but cannot sustain them because they threaten his carefully constructed false self. The authentic emotional responses are experienced as dangerous vulnerabilities rather than valued human experiences." The most revealing journal entries concern the final days after Elaine discovered his true identity, unlike the somewhat sanitized account in the memoir, which portrayed him as always in control. The journals showed a man in psychological free fall, alternating between rage, panic, strategic calculation, and moments of apparent remorse. E found the box, he wrote on April 16th. Saw it in her eyes the moment I walked in, that slight flinch when I touched her, the careful way she asked about the conference. She knows, or suspects, need to determine how much she's learned and what actions she's taken. Escape protocol. Alpha may be necessary, everything is prepared. The following day's entry was more frantic. She's been in my office. Files moved, computer accessed, called someone from the landline, the number blocked. Passport missing from the safe, she's planning something, need to accelerate the timeline. No longer a question of if, but when and how. The final entry, dated April 18th, the day the bodies were discovered, was chillingly concise. No viable path forward. She refuses cooperation, will not return to prison. Final protocols initiated. This entry, more than any other evidence, convinced investigators that Elaine's death had not been part of a mutual decision, as they had initially considered possible, but rather the final act of control by a man who viewed her as a possession rather than a partner. When you look at his language, she refuses cooperation and final protocols initiated. You're seeing the cold calculation of someone eliminating a problem, not a husband and wife making a tragic choice together, observed Agent Chen. This was murder, plain and simple. For Catherine Atherton Wells, who had lost her father to suicide after Harmon's original fraud, the new evidence provided a measure of validation. I've been saying for years that Harmon would never choose suicide unless he was cornered and had exhausted every other option, she stated. He didn't value human life, not others, and not even his own, enough to end it without being forced to that point. The storage unit also yielded financial records that expanded the scope of victim restitution efforts. Harmon had maintained detailed ledgers of all his fraudulent schemes, including the smaller operations conducted during his years as Thomas Richardson. These records identified an additional 23 victims who had not previously come forward, collectively losing approximately $2.3 million. Some victims were too embarrassed to report their losses, while others never realized they'd been defrauded at all, explained U.S. Attorney Miles. Harmon was skilled at creating plausible investment failures that victims would attribute to market forces rather than criminal activity. One such victim was Dr. Margaret Simmons, a neurosurgeon from Baltimore who had invested $275,000 with Thomas Richardson in what she believed was a medical technology venture fund. When the investment failed to produce returns, Richardson had provided elaborate market analysis showing how unexpected regulatory changes had impacted the sector. He sent me a 50-page report with graphs, regulatory citations, and comparative analysis of similar funds, Dr. Simmons recalled. It was so thoroughly researched and professionally presented that I never questioned whether the fund had existed at all. I chalked it up to bad timing and actually felt sorry for him having to deliver the bad news. The discovery of the storage unit also attracted attention from academic researchers studying white-collar crime, identity fraud, and psychopathology. The comprehensive nature of Harmon's records, spanning more than 3 decades of criminal activity, offered unprecedented insight into the evolution of a master manipulator. Dr. Marcus Chen, Director of Forensic Psychology at Johns Hopkins University, led a team analyzing the materials for patterns that might help identify similar offenders or prevent future crimes. What makes the Harmon case so valuable from a research perspective is the longitudinal documentation, Dr. Chen explained. We can trace how his methods evolved, how he learned from each success and failure, and how he adapted to changes in technology and financial systems over time. One of the most significant findings from this research was how Harmon had exploited the fragmented nature of identity verification systems across different sectors. He understood that identity isn't verified holistically in our society. Noted Dr. Chen, financial institutions verify certain aspects, government agencies others, employers yet others, but these systems rarely communicate effectively with each other. He exploited these gaps masterfully. This analysis led to recommendations for more integrated identity verification protocols across public and private sectors, changes that several states began implementing in what became informally known as Richardson Rules for identity confirmation. For the residents of Millfield, the new revelations reopened wounds that had begun to heal. The community that had started to move beyond the tragedy was forced to confront yet another layer of deception that had existed in their midst. Just when we thought we understood what had happened, we learned there was an even deeper level of calculation and cruelty, said Mayor Wilson. It's like psychological aftershocks that keep destabilizing our sense of what's real and trustworthy. Yet the community also found a way to transform their collective trauma into meaningful action. The Millfield Civic Association established a public awareness campaign about financial fraud targeting older adults. Local schools incorporated media literacy and critical thinking about online identities into their curricula. The public library hosted monthly forums on recognizing manipulation and building authentic connections in an age of digital personas. If there's any positive legacy to come from this tragedy, perhaps it's a community that's more aware, more genuinely connected, and better equipped to protect its vulnerable members, reflected Pastor Morgan 2 years after the deaths. For Jennifer Winters, the final pieces of her sister's story brought pain, but also a certain clarity. The hardest part was wondering if Elaine had chosen to die alongside this man, she explained. Now I know she was another victim, his final victim, and that brings its own kind of peace, however painful. Jennifer established a foundation in Elaine's name, dedicated to supporting victims of intimate partner deception, people whose lives had been entangled with individuals hiding dangerous secrets or false identities. The foundation provided both practical assistance with the legal and financial aftermath of such discoveries and psychological support for rebuilding trust and identity after profound betrayal. Elaine would want her story to help others, Jennifer said at the foundation's launch. She was always someone who transformed difficult experiences into wisdom she could share. In that spirit, we're trying to create meaning from something that seemed meaningless. As the criminal investigations concluded and the civil proceedings for victim restitution wound down, the case of Thomas Richardson and Elaine Richardson, or rather Michael Harmon, and the woman who had unwittingly married, a fiction, took its place in the annals of notable crimes. Law schools incorporated it into courses on financial fraud. Psychology programs studied it as a case of identity deception and manipulation. True crime writers and podcasters dissected every detail for audiences fascinated by the collision of ordinary suburban life with extraordinary deception. Yet for those closest to the case, the story resisted reduction to true crime entertainment. It remained a human tragedy, one that revealed uncomfortable truths about identity, intimacy, and the limits of knowing even those we believe we know best. The Richardson case forces us to confront the fact that we never fully know another person, reflected Agent Mitchell in a rare interview 3 years after the case concluded. Not because everyone is a potential Michael Harmon, but because human identity itself is complex, layered, and partially hidden, even from ourselves. She added, "The difference is that most people's hidden aspects reflect human vulnerability and fear of rejection. Harmon's reflected calculation and predation, recognizing that distinction between normal human complexity and pathological deception is perhaps the most important lesson this case can teach us." In the end, the final word on the case might belong to Elaine herself, through a passage in her journal discovered among her sister's possessions years after her death, written not during the crisis of discovery, but during a weekend retreat. The previous year, long before she knew the truth about her husband, sometimes I wake up before Thomas and watch him sleeping, wondering at the mystery of sharing my life with another human being. How strange that we can live alongside someone for years, sharing meals and confidences, dreams and disappointments, and still know that there are chambers in their heart we'll never fully enter. Perhaps that's not something to fear, but to respect. The ultimate privacy of another soul. Love isn't about complete knowledge, but about choosing to walk together anyway, carrying our separate mysteries into a shared future. The tragedy is that Elaine's philosophical acceptance of life's necessary mysteries became, in her case, an unwitting vulnerability, exploited by a man whose own mystery concealed not the universal human complexity she imagined, but a calculated,
continue to raise settling question out foundations of trust and identity, contemporary life.
In a world where we routinely accept digital personas at face value and where the traditional anchors of identity have become increasingly fluid, the Richardson case stands as both cautionary tale and call to attention, a reminder that while most human mysteries conceal ordinary flaws and fears, some hide dangers that come dressed in the comfortable disguise of the familiar. 3 years after the deaths on Sycamore Drive, as the case was receding from headlines into history, a development occurred that would reopen questions many had considered settled. Marissa Harmon, a 26-year-old graduate student at UCLA, came forward claiming to be Michael Harmon's biological daughter, a child whose existence had never been mentioned in any of the case files, media coverage, or Harmon's own extensive records. Marissa's emergence was prompted by a true crime documentary series that had featured the Richardson case. I grew up believing my father had died in a boating accident when I was 4, she explained in her initial statement to the FBI. It wasn't until I saw his face on screen, a face I recognized from childhood photographs, that I realized my entire family history was a fabrication. DNA testing confirmed Marissa's claim. She was indeed Michael Harmon's biological child, born in 1997 to Angela Durbin, a financial analyst who had worked briefly at Harmon Capital in Sacramento before the fraud collapsed. Angela had never revealed to authorities her relationship with Harmon or the existence of their child, instead creating her own fiction about the girl's parentage before relocating to Southern California. Angela had passed away from cancer in 2021, taking most of her secrets with her. However, she had left Marissa a sealed letter to be opened after her death, which contained a partial explanation and several photographs of Marissa as an infant with her father. "Your father was not who he claimed to be," Angela had written. "When I discovered this, I made the decision to protect you from both his crimes and his influence. I don't regret that choice, but you deserve to know the truth when you're ready to bear it." The letter didn't identify Harmon by name or mention his crimes specifically, suggesting Angela may not have known his true identity had been discovered or his ultimate fate. Investigators determined that she had never attempted to contact Harmon after fleeing Sacramento, instead creating a completely new life focused on raising her daughter. Marissa's emergence added a profoundly human dimension to a case that had often been discussed in terms of psychology, criminology, and financial fraud. Here was living proof that even the most calculated predators may leave behind unintended legacies, people whose lives continue to be shaped by their actions long after they themselves are gone. "I have no memory of him," Marissa acknowledged. In her first interview with FBI agents, But I've spent my whole life influenced by his absence and the stories my mother created to fill that void. Learning who he really was, what he did to so many people, has forced me to question everything about my identity. Most significantly, Marissa had inherited something from her father that would prove invaluable to investigators still working to unravel his financial web. A small wooden puzzle box given to her by her mother, who had claimed it was one of the few mementos of her father. "Mom told me my father made it himself," Marissa explained. "She said he'd been a hobbyist woodworker, which I now know was just another fiction. She insisted I keep it safe, that someday it might be important, but she never explained why." The puzzle box, which required a specific sequence of movements to open, contained a micro SD card with encrypted files that cybersecurity experts determined had been created in 2003. During Harmon's fugitive years before establishing himself as Thomas Richardson. When finally decrypted, the files revealed the existence of additional accounts holding approximately $8.3 million that had never been discovered during the previous investigations. Harmon appears to have created the puzzle box as an emergency fund of last resort, explained financial forensics specialist Nathan Cooper. The accounts were structured in a way that would have allowed access from anywhere in the world with the right codes, but they required biometric authentication that would have been almost impossible for anyone else to provide. Most investigators believed that Harmon had intended the box and its contents for his own use if all other resources were compromised. What they couldn't determine was why he had given it to Angela for safekeeping, or whether he had ever intended for his daughter to eventually access these funds. It's possible he gave the box to Ms. Durbin before he fully understood the extent of her pregnancy or her intention to keep the child, theorized Agent Chen. Or perhaps he viewed it as a form of insurance, leaving assets with someone who had reason to protect him because of their shared child. The discovery of additional funds reopened the victim restitution process, providing the original Sacramento victims with nearly complete recovery of their losses, a rare outcome in financial fraud cases of this magnitude and age. For many of the elderly victims or their heirs, this final chapter brought a measure of financial closure to a decades-long ordeal. "I had long since stopped expecting to see that money again," said Helen Kapowski, now 85, one of the original victims. "I'm not sure if it changes anything about how I feel about what happened, but it will make my grandchildren's lives a little easier, and there's some comfort in that." For Marissa, the discovery of her biological father's crimes initiated a complex journey of identity reconciliation. As a doctoral student in clinical psychology, specializing in trauma and resilience, she was perhaps uniquely equipped to process the psychological implications of her parentage. Nevertheless, the revelation shook the foundations of her self-understanding. "There's a strange duality to inheriting the genetics of someone capable of such calculated harm," she reflected. "I find myself constantly questioning which aspects of my personality might reflect his influence. Am I drawn to psychology because I share his interest in understanding human vulnerability, just channeled in a more constructive direction?" These aren't comfortable questions, but they're necessary ones. Marissa's emergence prompted renewed interest in how children of notorious criminals integrate knowledge of their parentage into their identities. Dr. Vanessa Rodriguez, a specialist in transgenerational trauma at Columbia University, began a long-term study with Marissa's participation, examining how biological children of high-profile offenders navigate their complex inheritances. "The children of violent offenders have been studied extensively," noted Dr. Rodriguez, "but there's been less research on the descendants of predatory white-collar criminals. These children often grapple with less visible but equally profound Questions about moral inheritance and identity. Marissa made the difficult decision to go public with her story rather than maintaining anonymity, establishing a support network for children of notorious offenders. When we remain silent out of shame for crimes we didn't commit, we remain isolated in our experience, she explained. Breaking that isolation has been essential to my own healing process. Her organization, Legacy Reclamation, quickly attracted over 200 members, individuals with similar backgrounds, struggling to reconcile their personal identities with the public narrative surrounding their parents' crimes. The group offered resources, online forums, and regular conferences addressing the unique psychological challenges faced by those whose family histories included high-profile criminal behavior. "We didn't choose our parentage," read the organization's mission statement, "but we can choose how we respond to that knowledge and what legacy we create for ourselves." Marissa's emergence also created unexpected connections with others affected by her father's crimes. Initially hesitant, Jennifer Winters eventually agreed to meet with Marissa at the latter's request. Their first meeting, which both had expected to be brief and potentially awkward, lasted nearly 6 hours. "I was prepared to see Michael Harmon in her features and feel revulsion," Jennifer later admitted. "Instead, I found myself sitting across from a thoughtful young woman grappling with a burden she never asked to carry." There was something healing in that recognition, that his story didn't end with Elaine's death or his own, but continues, in more redemptive ways, through someone determined to create good from that legacy. The two women, linked by a man neither had truly known, developed an unexpected bond. Marissa began volunteering with the Elaine Richardson Foundation, bringing her professional expertise in trauma psychology to the organization's work with victims of deception. Jennifer, in turn, became a featured speaker at legacy reclamation conferences, offering perspective on how criminal behavior impacts not only direct victims, but also the offender's own family members. "There's a strange symmetry to our connection," Marissa observed. "Jennifer lost her sister because of who my father was. I lost the possibility of knowing my father because of what he did. We're both navigating absences created by the same person." Catherine Atherton Wells, whose father had taken his life after losing his savings to Harmon's original fraud, initially declined Marissa's outreach. "I cannot and will not hold you responsible for your father's actions," she wrote in response to Marissa's letter, "but I'm not in a place where contact would be healing for me." 2 years later, however, Catherine reached out on her own initiative after attending a conference where Marissa had spoken about intergenerational patterns of harm and healing. Their subsequent meeting was more complicated than Marissa's connection, with Jennifer, the loss of Catherine's father, creating a more direct line of harm, but ultimately productive for both women. There's something powerful about looking into the eyes of someone connected to the man who destroyed my father's life and seeing not continuation, but transformation, Catherine reflected. It doesn't undo the past, but it offers a different vision of the future. For investigators who had worked the case, Marissa's existence and the subsequent discoveries prompted reassessment of certain assumptions about Michael Harmon. The man who had appeared to operate in isolation, maintaining only strategic relationships that served his purposes, had in fact fathered a child, suggesting at least one relationship with emotional dimensions beyond calculation. The existence of his daughter doesn't fundamentally change our understanding of Harmon as a predatory figure, noted Dr. Warren, who had extensively studied Harmon's psychology. But it does add complexity to the picture. Even the most compartmentalized personalities can experience genuine attachment under specific circumstances. Angela Durbin's decision to flee with her unborn child rather than leverage her connection to Harmon raised particularly interesting questions. According to former colleagues at Harmon Capital, Angela had been one of the few employees who might have suspected the fraudulent nature of the operation before its collapse. Her hasty departure 2 months before the scheme unraveled had been noted in the original investigation, but never fully explained. The timing suggests she discovered either the fraud or something concerning Harmon personally that prompted her to sever all connections, proposed Agent Mitchell. The fact that she chose to raise their child entirely separated from him, creating an elaborate fiction rather than seeking child support or other assistance, indicates she may have recognized dangerous aspects of his personality that made him unfit as a parent. Through interviews with Angela's former friends and colleagues, investigators pieced together a picture of a brief but intense relationship that had unfolded during the final months of Harmon Capital's operation. Angela, by all accounts, intelligent and ambitious, had initially been impressed by Harmon's charisma and apparent financial acumen. Their relationship had progressed quickly, but ended abruptly when Angela accessed files she wasn't authorized to view. She came to my apartment at 2 a.m. with a suitcase, asking to stay for a few days, recalled Rachel Martinez, Angela's former roommate. She wouldn't explain what had happened, just said she'd made a terrible mistake in judgment and needed to get away from Michael. She was gone within a week, new job, new apartment across town. When the Harmon Capital story broke a couple months later, it all made sense. What remained unclear was whether Angela had known of Angela's pregnancy when she fled, or if he had ever attempted to locate her and their child during his years as a fugitive. No references to Angela or a child appeared in any of his extensive journals or records, suggesting either complete disinterest or, perhaps more intriguingly, a rare compartment of his life he chose not to document. The absence of any mention of his child in his otherwise exhaustive records might actually be the most humanizing thing about Harmon, suggested Dr. Warren. It's possible that in that one area of his life he recognized a line even he shouldn't cross, involving a child in his criminal existence. Marissa herself had more pragmatic theories. My mother was incredibly resourceful and determined. I think she simply made it impossible for him to find us without drawing attention he couldn't afford. Whether he tried or not seems less relevant than her success in creating a safe life for us both. The files recovered from the puzzle box included not only financial records, but also several encrypted personal documents that provided glimpses into Harmon's thinking during the years between his flight from Sacramento and his emergence as Thomas Richardson. Among these was what appeared to be a letter never sent to Angela, dated 2001, when Marissa would have been 4 years old. "I saw a child in a park today who reminded me of possibilities foreclosed," he had written. "There are times when I question whether the freedom I've purchased is worth the price paid, not by others whose concerns have never much troubled me, but by myself in potential connections abandoned. This is uncharacteristic sentimentality. I realize, and likely to pass. The path chosen cannot be unchosen without consequences I'm unwilling to bear." For many following the case, Marissa's emergence and subsequent journey offered a redemptive counterpoint to an otherwise dark narrative. Here was someone genetically linked to a predator who had dedicated her life to healing trauma rather than creating it, a living testament to the triumph of nurture over nature and individual choice over inheritance. "I don't believe in moral DNA," Marissa stated in a widely shared interview. "My father made choices based on his values and priorities. I make different choices based on mine. The only biological inheritance that matters is the opportunity to demonstrate that his path was not inevitable." As the 5th anniversary of the Richardson deaths approached, Millfield had largely returned to the quiet suburban rhythm disrupted by the tragedy. The house on Sycamore Drive had changed hands again, this time to a retired couple who knew nothing of its history when purchasing. Neighbors, by tacit agreement, chose not to burden them with the knowledge. The memorial garden in the community park remained, however, its plants now mature, and the sculpture at its center weathered to a natural patina. Community members still occasionally left flowers there, not specifically for Thomas or Elaine Richardson, but for all those affected by the ripples of deception that had spread outward from that central point. Jennifer Winters continued her work with the Elaine Richardson Foundation, which had expanded its mission to include educational programs on financial literacy and recognizing manipulation. Elaine would have wanted her story to protect others. Jennifer often remarked at foundation events, "Education is the most powerful protection against predators who depend on ignorance and isolation to succeed." The FBI's case file on Michael Harmon Thomas Richardson remained among the most extensive in the Bureau's history of white-collar crime investigations, spanning more than 25 years from the original Sacramento fraud to the discoveries prompted by Marissa's emergence. The case became required study at the FBI Academy, with particular focus on the sophisticated identity concealment techniques that had allowed Harmon to evade capture for so long. The Harmon case demonstrates both the extraordinary lengths to which some fugitives will go to evade justice and the persistence of small details that eventually lead to discovery, noted the case study introduction. No deception, however elaborate, remains perfect indefinitely. Time inevitably reveals what has been hidden. For those who had lived through the events, victims, investigators, community members, and family, the case defied reduction to simple lessons or morality tales. It remained a complex human story about identity, deception, love, betrayal, justice, and the shadow legacies that extend beyond any single life. As Marissa Harmon reflected in the conclusion of her memoir, published on the 5th anniversary of the discovery that changed her understanding of her origins, "I am not my father's redemption. That was never possible. But I am living proof that his story didn't end with his death, just as it didn't begin with his crimes." We are all connected to longer narratives that extend beyond our individual choices, tangled webs of harm and healing that continue long after we ourselves are gone. The question is not whether we can escape these connections, but what we choose to do with them. For residents of Millfield, for the victims in Sacramento, for the investigators who had tracked a ghost across decades, and for the family members left to make sense of it all, that choosing continued, the daily decision to move forward, to create meaning from tragedy, and to build connections founded on truth rather than deception. In the end, perhaps the most fitting epitaph for the case came not from any official report or psychological assessment, but from a note left anonymously at the Memorial Garden on the 5th anniversary of the deaths. Written on a simple card, tucked among spring flowers, it read, "May we see each other clearly, love each other honestly, and remember that our stories continue through each life we touch. Truth eventually finds its way to light." 7 years after the deaths on Sycamore Drive, an unexpected communication arrived at the FBI field office in Philadelphia. A package containing a weathered leather journal was delivered by courier, with no return address and only a brief typed note. "Found among my late uncle's possessions. Appears to be relevant to the Richardson-Harmon case. Forensic analysis confirmed. The journal belonged to Stanford Wheeler, the Philadelphia attorney who had handled much of Thomas Richardson's legal work for over 15 years. Wheeler had died 6 months earlier of natural causes at age 76, taking to his grave whatever knowledge he may have had about his client's true identity. The journal, which covered the period from 2004 to 2023, revealed a relationship far more complex than investigators had previously understood. "I met with TR again today," read an entry from September 2004. "Something about him remains off. inconsistencies. In his backstory, knowledge gaps where there shouldn't be any. The documentation is impeccable, but there's a performance quality to his persona that triggers my old prosecutor instincts. And yet, the fees are substantial, and suspicion isn't evidence. I'll proceed with caution. Wheeler, it appeared, had harbored doubts about Thomas Richardson from their earliest interactions. As a former prosecutor who had transitioned to private practice in the late 1990s, he possessed a finely tuned sense for deception. Yet the journal documented his gradual shift from wariness to complicity as the professional relationship deepened. "Another discrepancy today," he wrote in 2007. To mentioned attending Stanford's business program in the early 90s, but 3 months ago he specifically said Northwestern. When I noted this casually, the recovery was immediate. Claimed it was a guest lecture series he'd attended at Stanford while enrolled at Northwestern. Smooth, practiced. He's lying about something significant, yet every background check comes back clean. The question becomes, is it my business given attorney-client privilege if the lies don't relate to our current work? By 2010, Wheeler's entries suggested he had moved from suspicion to tacit acceptance of his client's likely fraudulent identity. "I've made my peace with the arrangement," he wrote. "Whatever T did in his previous life, and I'm increasingly certain there was one, he's maintained a legitimate business and personal life for years now. No one seems harmed by the deception, and I've insulated myself legally. The moral calculus is less clear, but at my age, moral ambiguity and I are old companions." The journal documented interactions not only with Thomas, but occasionally with Elaine as well, offering glimpses of their marriage through an outsider's perceptive lens. "Dinner with the Richardsons at Le Bec Fin," read an entry from 2013. E. continues to impress. Intelligent, perceptive, genuinely warm. She clearly adores T, though I occasionally catch moments of puzzlement when he references his past, as if trying to reconcile inconsistencies she's noted but dismissed. T watches her constantly when she's engaged with others. Not jealousy, something more calculated, assessment of performance perhaps. I find myself wanting to warn her, which is both unprofessional and unwarranted. Warn her of what, exactly? That her husband may not be who he claims. Without evidence, that's simply destructive. Most significantly, the journal contained entries from April 2023, the period immediately preceding the deaths. Wheeler had apparently been among the last people to speak with Thomas Richardson before the final tragedy unfolded. Unexpected call. "From T today," he wrote on April 17th, voice tight with controlled panic, asked hypothetical questions about identity fraud prosecution statutes of limitations, wanted to know if a spouse could be charged as an accessory after the fact if they learned of a significant fraud, but didn't immediately report it. When I pressed for context, he claimed it was for a friend in trouble. Classic deflection. Something's collapsed in his carefully constructed world. The final entry, dated April 18th, the day the bodies were discovered, contained information that prompted the FBI to reopen aspects of the investigation. T called at 6 a.m., clearly having not slept, rambling about contingencies and exit strategies. Mentioned the Carolina property repeatedly, insisted it must be maintained regardless of what happens. When I asked directly if he was in legal trouble, he laughed in a way I've never heard before, hollow, desperate. Said something cryptic. "Wheeler, you've been holding the map all along without knowing it. If things go silent, wait 6 months, then check the Fleming file, bottom drawer, blue folder." Call ended abruptly. Attempted to reach him twice since. No response. Considering my legal obligations here. The Fleming file, referenced in Wheeler's journal, led investigators to a property in coastal North Carolina, a 3-bedroom house on a remote stretch of the Outer Banks, purchased through a shell company in 2008. The property, which appeared on no previous asset lists connected to Harmon, had continued to be maintained by a management company, with automated payments from an offshore account even after his death. When agents searched the house, they discovered something that defied all previous understanding of the case. Evidence that Harmon had been planning to flee there with Elaine, rather than eliminate her as originally concluded. The property contained a hidden room accessible through a concealed door in the master bedroom closet. Inside were 2 complete sets of identity documents, one for Thomas Richardson and one for Elaine, along with approximately $200,000 in cash, cryptocurrency cold storage wallets, and a detailed plan for living off the grid. Most tellingly, there were 2 handwritten letters, one from Thomas to Elaine, never delivered, and a half-finished response from Elaine. Thomas's letter, dated April 16, 2023, presented a plea and a confession. By the time you read this, you'll know the truth about who I was. I won't insult your intelligence by claiming Thomas Richardson was entirely real, but I need you to understand that my feelings for you were never part of the deception. I built Thomas to survive, but somewhere in those 18 years, he became more than a disguise, in part because of you. I've prepared a way out for both of us. The authorities will never stop looking for Michael Harmon, but Thomas and Elaine can disappear, start over somewhere new. I know I'm asking you to sacrifice everything based on the word of a man who's lied to you for your entire marriage. The irony isn't lost on me, but I'm asking anyway because the alternative is losing you, and that's the one thing I can't bear, even if I deserve it. Elaine's unfinished response, written on April 17th, revealed her profound struggle with his revelation. I don't know what to call you anymore. Thomas feels like addressing a character in a play, but Michael belongs to a criminal I never knew. Whoever you are, the man who held me through my father's funeral, who built me bookshelves perfectly sized for my art history volumes, who knows exactly how I take my coffee. I'm trying to understand how you could maintain this deception for 18 years. Part of me wants to hate you. I should hate you. The people you hurt, the lives you destroyed, they deserve justice. But another part recognizes that if everything was a lie, I wouldn't be feeling this conflicted. Some core of what we shared must have been real, or the betrayal wouldn't hurt so deeply. I need time to think. Your offer to run away together is... The letter ended mid-sentence, suggesting Elaine had been interrupted while writing, perhaps by the final confrontation that led to their deaths. These discoveries forced investigators to completely reassess the timeline and circumstances of the final days. The prevailing theory of murder-suicide, with Harmon eliminating Elaine to prevent exposure, no longer aligned with the evidence. Based on these new materials, we believe Harmon actually presented Elaine with a choice between turning him in or fleeing together under new identities, explained Agent Chen, who returned from retirement to consult on the reopened investigation. The North Carolina property was prepared as a temporary safe house while they established new lives elsewhere. This reinterpretation cast the final confrontation in the Richardson home in an entirely different light. If Harmon hadn't intended to kill Elaine, what had precipitated the deadly outcome in their garage? A breakthrough came when investigators re-examined security footage from neighboring properties and identified a vehicle that had parked briefly on a side street near the Richardson home on the afternoon of April 18th, approximately 2 hours before Officer Hayes discovered the bodies. The vehicle was registered to Maxwell Donovan, the private investigator who had previously conducted background checks for Harmon and later cooperated with authorities. When confronted with this evidence, Donovan, now serving a reduced sentence for his role in Harmon's schemes, provided yet another shocking piece of the puzzle. Harmon called me in a panic on April 17th, Donovan admitted, said his cover was blown, that his wife had discovered everything. He was rambling about contingency plans, offshore accounts, new identities, things I'd helped him set up years earlier. He asked me to come to the house the next day to help facilitate their disappearance. According to Donovan, when he arrived at the Richardson home, he found a scene of tension rather than preparation. They were arguing. Elaine was saying she couldn't just vanish, that she needed to contact her sister first, make sure certain people from Sacramento got restitution. Harmon was insisting there wasn't time, that any delay risked everything. I'd never seen him lose control of a situation before. It was unsettling. Donovan claimed that as the argument escalated, Harmon revealed that he had been monitoring Elaine's communications and knew she had contacted the Sacramento District Attorney's office. He felt betrayed, said she'd made promises she hadn't kept. She countered that she'd made no definitive commitments and was still deciding. That's when he pulled out the gun. In Donovan's account, the next moments unfolded with devastating speed. Harmon, increasingly desperate, had suggested a suicide pact as an alternative to prison, claiming they could die together rather than face separation and public humiliation. When Elaine refused and moved toward the door, he threatened her directly. I intervened then, Donovan claimed, told him he was spiraling, making irreversible mistakes. For a moment he seemed to regain his composure. He apologized, lowered the weapon. Elaine was crying but steady, said she needed space to think clearly, suggested they speak with their attorney together to explore options. Donovan stated that he'd left at that point, believing the immediate crisis had been diffused. Harmon seemed calmer, rational again. Elaine was shaken but resolute. I thought they would talk through it, reach some compromise. I never imagined he would actually go through with killing her, or himself. Investigators were skeptical of Donovan's account, particularly his claimed innocence in the deaths. Donovan had every reason to ensure Harmon's secrets died with him, noted Agent Chen. As the facilitator of many of Harmon's false identities and background investigations, he stood to face significant additional charges if Harmon cooperated with authorities. A more disturbing theory emerged, that Donovan himself might have played a direct role in the deaths, staging them as murder-suicide to silence both Harmon and Elaine. Forensic re-examination of evidence from the scene yielded trace DNA that couldn't be ruled out as Donovan's, though the sample was too degraded for definitive matching. When confronted with this possibility, Donovan maintained his innocence while offering a final, chilling detail. The last thing Harmon said to me as I was leaving was, "Some exits can only be made alone." At the time, I thought he was being philosophical. In retrospect, perhaps it was his way of saying goodbye. The revelation of the North Carolina property and Donovan's potential involvement transformed public understanding of the case once again. The narrative of a cold-blooded predator eliminating his wife to protect himself gave way to something more nuanced, a desperate man attempting to preserve both his freedom and his marriage, unraveling when forced to confront the incompatibility of those desires. For Jennifer Winters, these revelations brought complicated emotions rather than closure. Learning that Thomas, or Michael, might have genuinely cared for my sister doesn't undo the deception or bring her back, she reflected, but it does suggest that something in their relationship was authentic, which matters to me. Elaine wasn't just collateral damage in his schemes. She was someone he actually valued. However, twisted the expression of that feeling became at the end. Similarly, Marissa Harmon found in these developments a more complex picture of her biological father. "I've spent years trying to understand who he was beyond the crimes," she explained. "These latest discoveries suggest a man capable of genuine attachment, however compromised by his fundamental dishonesty. That doesn't excuse anything he did, but it does challenge the two-dimensional villain narrative. The North Carolina property, which legally defaulted to Harmon's estate, became the subject of extended litigation. Eventually, the courts ruled that proceeds from its sale should be divided between the Victim Restitution Fund and Elaine's estate, a decision that acknowledged both the property's origins in fraud and its apparent intended purpose as a refuge for both Harmon and his wife. For the investigators who had studied the case for nearly a decade, the final picture that emerged was one of profound ambiguity. Neither the simple murder-suicide initially presumed nor the mutual decision later considered, but something messier and more human. In the end, what happened in that garage remains partially speculative, admitted Agent Mitchell in the FBI's final report on the case. The forensic evidence allows for multiple scenarios. What seems increasingly clear is that Thomas Richardson and Michael Harmon weren't entirely separate identities, but aspects of the same complex individual, a man capable of both calculated harm and genuine connection, whose compartmentalized existence ultimately collapsed when those worlds collided. Dr. Warren, who had studied the case extensively, offered perhaps the most insightful assessment. Harmon's tragedy wasn't that he couldn't feel authentic emotion. It's that he couldn't integrate those feelings with his fundamental dishonesty. He wanted both the freedom that came from living outside social and legal constraints and the connection that requires genuine vulnerability. Those desires were fundamentally incompatible, and that incompatibility ultimately proved fatal. 10 years after the deaths, as public interest in the case faded, the most enduring legacy wasn't in true crime documentaries or FBI case studies, but in the quiet work of those left behind. Jennifer Winter's foundation had helped thousands of individuals recovering from intimate partner deception. Marissa Harmon's organization had created supportive communities for those struggling with the complex legacy of a parent's crimes. The Memorial Garden in Millfield Park remained, tended now by community volunteers who might not even remember the specific tragedy that prompted its creation. The sculpture at its center had weathered into a natural patina, its broken pieces reflecting light in ways both fractured and beautiful, much like the truths eventually revealed about the lives and deaths of the couple once known as Thomas and Elaine Richardson. Perhaps the final word on the case belonged to Elaine herself through a passage found in her journal years after her death. We all present versions of ourselves to the world, edited, curated selves designed to be accepted and loved. The question isn't whether we're performing, but whether the performance serves truth or deception. Are we revealing our authentic cores through selective presentation or hiding them entirely? The difference seems crucial, though the line between can be devastatingly thin. For those who studied the case, from FBI agents to psychology researchers, to true crime enthusiasts, this fundamental question remained at its heart. How much deception can exist within genuine connection before it poisons the relationship entirely? At what point does a constructed identity become authentic through sustained performance? And perhaps most hauntingly, if Thomas Richardson hadn't been discovered, would the life he shared with Elaine have continued indefinitely in what appeared to be domestic contentment, built atop a foundation of lies? These questions extended beyond the specifics of the Richardson case to broader concerns about identity in modern America. In an age of carefully curated social media presences, digital relationships, and increasingly sophisticated technology for both verification and deception, the boundaries between authentic and performed selves had become increasingly blurred. For everyone, the Richardson case isn't an aberration so much as an extreme example of tensions we all navigate, observed Dr. Simone Harper in an updated edition of her book. The need to present coherent identities while acknowledging our own internal contradictions, the desire for both freedom and connection, the selective truths we offer even to those closest to us. These are universal human experiences, amplified to tragic proportions in this particular story. As new technologies made identity verification simultaneously more sophisticated and more vulnerable to manipulation, the Richardson case became a cautionary reference point, cited in congressional hearings on digital privacy, academic papers, on identity confirmation protocols, and public discussions about trust in an age of increasing virtuality. Yet for those who had known Thomas and Elaine Richardson, the neighbors who had shared meals with them, colleagues who had worked alongside them, friends who had celebrated milestones with them, the case remained fundamentally personal rather than philosophical. It represented the unsettling reality that proximity doesn't guarantee knowledge, that you can live alongside someone for years and still not truly see them. "I think about them often," reflected Sarah Dominguez, who had lived across from the Richardsons for over a decade. "Not the sensation their deaths became, but the neighbors I thought I knew. The Thomas who helped me jump-start my car on cold mornings, the Elaine who brought soup when I was sick. Were those moments genuine kindness or calculated performance? And does the distinction even matter in the end?" Perhaps that was the most unsettling legacy of the case, the recognition that in our interactions with others, we can never fully distinguish performance from authenticity. We can only choose to extend trust while acknowledging its inherent vulnerability, the same choice Elaine Richardson made each day of her 18-year marriage until the moment that choice was irrevocably withdrawn. 15 years after the deaths on Sycamore Drive, when most involved had moved on or passed away, an unexpected discovery brought the case back into public consciousness one final time. During renovation of the old Philadelphia courthouse, workers discovered a sealed safety deposit box in a forgotten storage room. Inside was a single USB drive with a handwritten label, "Richardson, Final Testament." Digital forensics confirmed. The drive contained a video recording of Thomas Richardson, or Michael Harmon, created just hours before his death. The 53-minute recording, made in his home office with the door locked, appeared to be his attempt to explain himself. To posterity, "If you're watching this, I'm gone," he began, his normally composed demeanor noticeably strained. "The specifics of my departure aren't important. What matters is setting the record straight, though I recognize the irony of a lifelong liar suddenly concerned with truth." The recording provided previously unknown details about his early life as Kevin Pearson, confirmed through school records, and his gradual evolution into a master of deception. He described his first fraud, a modest investment scheme in college, that went undiscovered as the moment that changed his trajectory. That initial success was intoxicating, he admitted. Not just the money, but the revelation that reality is malleable, that with sufficient confidence and preparation, you can reconstruct not only your circumstances, but your entire identity. Most people live within the constraints of a single self. I discovered I could move between selves like changing clothes. The recording confirmed many details uncovered during the investigation while filling crucial gaps. He acknowledged the frauds in Denver and Phoenix before Sacramento, described his escape routes and methods, and outlined the creation of the Thomas Richardson identity with clinical precision. Most striking was his discussion of Elaine, the only point in the recording where emotion seemed to break through his calculated presentation. Elaine was supposed to be functional, window dressing for a respectable life, he said, his voice noticeably different. I selected her with the same cold analysis I'd applied to everything else, socially connected but not prominent, intelligent but not suspicious, attractive but not attention-seeking. The perfect accessory to legitimacy. He paused, seemingly struggling with his composure. What I never anticipated was that she would become real to me, that Thomas Richardson, the fiction I created, would develop genuine attachments, Over time, the performance became permeable. There were moments I forgot I was playing a role. The recording confirmed that Elaine had discovered his true identity through the hidden lockbox and confronted him with her knowledge. His description of her reaction differed significantly from earlier accounts. She wasn't hysterical or accusatory, he recalled. She was disappointed. Said she'd always sensed something wasn't quite aligned in our life together, small inconsistencies. She'd dismissed out of love. Asked if anything between us had been real. I found myself unable to maintain the performance for perhaps the first time in decades. According to his account, he had indeed presented her with options. Turn him in, leave him, or flee together to start over. The North Carolina property had been prepared years earlier as a contingency, though originally intended for his solo escape. I offered her a new life together, knowing it was fundamentally selfish, he admitted. Asking her to abandon everything, her business, her sister, her friends, to preserve what remained of us. To my astonishment, she didn't immediately refuse. Said she needed time to think, to process. The most revelatory portion of the recording addressed the final hours, the period that had remained most ambiguous despite years of investigation. He confirmed that Elaine had contacted authorities but hadn't yet provided definitive information about his identity or whereabouts. She was negotiating internally, trying to reconcile her moral compass with her feelings for me, he explained. I monitored her communications, watched her gathering evidence, preparing statements. Part of me admired her thoroughness, so like the woman I'd grown to love. Another part recognized she was constructing my downfall, however reluctantly. His account of Donovan's involvement partially aligned with the investigator's later testimony, though with crucial differences. He confirmed Donovan's presence at the house on the final day, but portrayed him as far more active in the escalating situation. Max suggested a third option when it became clear Elaine was wavering. He stated flatly, said sometimes problems require permanent solutions. I'd never considered harming her, despite what everyone will assume. But Max was always more pragmatic than sentimental. When I rejected his implication, he reminded me how many people's lives would be destroyed if I were captured, not just mine, but everyone in our professional orbit. Said sometimes sacrifice is necessary. The recording grew, increasingly tense as he described the final confrontation. According to his account, after Donovan left, he and Elaine had reached a tentative agreement to consult with Wheeler, their attorney, before making any irreversible decisions. They were preparing to leave when Donovan unexpectedly returned. I never saw the gun, he said, his voice hollow. Heard Elaine scream, turned to see her clutching her chest. Max stood in the doorway, said this was the cleanest solution for everyone. I lunged for him. After that, nothing. I assume whatever you found was staged to implicate me. The recording ended with a statement that challenged 15 years of established narrative. I've been many things, liar, thief, fraud, coward, but I never harmed Elaine. Whatever they tell you about how we died, know that much is true. She was the one authentic thing in my manufactured life. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit reviewed the recording extensively, assessing its credibility against known evidence and psychological profiles. Their conclusion was measured. While certain elements of Harmon's final testimony align with physical evidence, his claim of Donovan's direct involvement in the deaths cannot be definitively verified or refuted at this time. His portrayal of his relationship with Elaine Richardson shows greater emotional depth than previously assessed, though this may represent self-serving revisionism rather than genuine sentiment. The recording's discovery prompted authorities to reopen their investigation into Maxwell Donovan, who had been released after serving his reduced sentence and disappeared from public view. Attempts to locate him proved unsuccessful, with evidence suggesting he had left the country under yet another identity. perhaps using techniques learned from his former client. For Jennifer Winters, now in her 70s, the recording brought emotional complexity rather than closure. "I want to dismiss it entirely as one final manipulation," she acknowledged. And yet there's something in his voice when he speaks about Elaine that rings true. The possibility that he actually loved my sister, in his damaged way, is somehow both comforting and more tragic than believing it was all calculation. Marissa. Harmon, who had built a successful career as a clinical psychologist specializing in identity and deception, viewed the recording with professional detachment. Whether his final account is factually accurate matters less than what it reveals. About his self-perception, she observed, he needed to see himself as capable of authentic connection, even at the end. Whether that represents growth or simply another layer of self-deception is ultimately unknowable. For the residents of Millfield, most of whom had moved on or away, in the intervening years, the recording's discovery barely registered. The tragedy that had once defined their community had faded into local history, a story told to newcomers with increasing distance and decreasing detail. The Sycamore Drive house had changed hands multiple times, its connection to the Richardson case diminished by renovations and the passage of time. Only the memorial garden remained as a tangible reminder, though few visitors now recognized its specific significance. Perhaps the most fitting epilogue came not from the recording itself, but from a letter Elaine had written to her sister, 2 weeks before discovering her husband's true identity, found years later among Jennifer's papers after her death. "There's a particular quality to long marriages," Elaine had written. "A comfortable assumption that you know the other person completely. Yet occasionally Tom will say something unexpected or react in a way I can't predict, and I'm reminded that we remain fundamentally mysterious to each other, even after all these years. I find that reassuring somehow, that even in the most intimate relationships there's always more to discover. In that observation lay perhaps the most profound truth of the entire case, that complete knowledge of another person remains impossible, that trust always requires a leap of faith, and that connection persists in the spaces between what we know and what we can never fully understand." 20 years after the deaths on Sycamore Drive, when the case had largely faded from public consciousness, a series of anonymous tips led federal investigators to a remote fishing village in Uruguay. There, living under the name David Mercer, they found Maxwell Donovan, the private investigator whose shadowy involvement in the final hours of Thomas and Elaine Richardson's lives had never been fully determined. Donovan, now in his 70s, and in failing health, offered no resistance when confronted by authorities. "Took you long enough," he reportedly said, as agents presented their identification. "I always wondered if he'd left something behind that would eventually lead you here." Extradited to the United States, Donovan provided a deathbed confession that rewrote the final chapter of the Richardson case. His account, recorded over 3 days and independently verified through evidence he had preserved, painted a picture starkly different from all previous narratives. "Harmon was my most valuable client for over a decade," Donovan began, "but he was also my partner. The Richardson identity wasn't his creation, it was mine. I had been developing it for years as an exit strategy for myself, but he offered me $3 million for the complete package. That was the real beginning of our arrangement." According to Donovan, his relationship with Harmon extended far beyond professional services. They had been co-conspirators in numerous schemes, with Donovan providing the intelligence and background work, while Harmon, with his charisma and financial acumen, executed the frauds. "We had a perfect system," Donovan explained. "I identified potential victims, created the backstories and documentation, and handled the contingency planning. he closed the deals. We were effective because we understood each other, both functional sociopaths who recognized the advantages of collaboration. Their partnership had included the Sacramento fraud that first put Harmon on the FBI's radar, as well as the smaller schemes conducted during his years as Thomas Richardson. What no one had previously understood was that Donovan had been an equal financial beneficiary throughout, receiving nearly half of all proceeds while maintaining his legitimate business as cover. The most revelatory aspect of Donovan's confession concerned Elaine. Contrary to all previous understanding, Elaine had not discovered her husband's identity by accident. The lockbox had been deliberately placed where she would find it, by Donovan. Not Harmon. Michael was getting soft, Donovan explained. 18 years as Thomas Richardson, and he'd started to believe his own cover story. Talked about legitimate investments, retiring from our side activities. Worst of all, he'd developed genuine feelings for Elaine. Started keeping separate accounts, making plans that didn't include me. That wasn't our agreement. Donovan described how he had orchestrated the unraveling of Thomas Richardson's identity as punishment for Harmon's attempt to exit their partnership. I needed leverage to remind him of our mutual vulnerability, he said. I never intended for it to end with their deaths. That was an escalation neither of us anticipated. His account of the final day confirmed aspects of Harmon's recorded testimony while contradicting others. He admitted returning to the house after initially leaving, but insisted the confrontation that followed was between Harmon and Elaine, with his intervention coming only after violence had already erupted. I walked in and found her already wounded. Michael standing there with the gun, Donovan claimed. He turned it on me and blamed me for destroying everything. We struggled. The gun went off again. When I realized they were both fatally wounded, I made a decision to protect myself. Arranged the scene to look like murder-suicide. Kept the gun which had my prints on it from the struggle. Digital forensics experts analyzing Donovan's devices discovered photographs taken in the Richardson garage immediately after the deaths. Images that had been modified to remove Donovan's reflection in the car window, suggesting he had been present but had carefully edited the evidence. Most disturbingly, they found a series of text messages between Donovan and Harmon in the days leading up to the tragedy. These messages revealed that Harmon had indeed been planning to end their partnership and had threatened to expose Donovan if pressured. "You forget I know where all the bodies are buried," Harmon had written 3 days before his death, literally in some cases. "Push me further and we both go down. Walk away now, we both keep our freedom and fortunes." Donovan's reply had been chillingly prescient. "No clean exits in this business, Michael. You know that better than anyone." The final message, sent just hours before the deaths, suggested Donovan had never intended to let the confrontation end peacefully. One way or another, this concludes today. Your choice, whether it's clean or messy, with Donovan's confession and the supporting evidence, prosecutors posthumously cleared Harmon of direct responsibility for Elaine's death, though his role in creating the circumstances that led to the tragedy remained undisputed. Donovan, already terminal with pancreatic cancer, was convicted of 2 counts of second-degree murder, but died 3 weeks into his sentence. For the few remaining individuals connected to the case, this final revelation brought complex emotions. Jennifer Winters had passed away 2 years earlier, never knowing this last piece of the puzzle. Catherine Atherton Wells, now in her 70s, found the resolution bittersweet. Learning that Harmon didn't physically pull the trigger doesn't change the fundamental truth that his lifetime of deception created the conditions for tragedy, she reflected. And yet, there's something almost poetic in the revelation that he too was ultimately betrayed by someone he trusted. Marissa Harmon, now a distinguished professor of psychology, viewed the confession through both personal and professional lenses. From a psychological perspective, partnerships between individuals with antisocial tendencies usually end in betrayal, she observed. What's remarkable here is that their collaboration lasted as long as it did. As for what it means to me personally, it suggests my father was capable of genuine evolution, however limited. His feelings for Elaine appear to have been real enough to threaten his criminal partnership. That's a small mercy, I suppose. For the residents of Millfield, the news barely registered. The community had changed significantly over 2 decades, with few remaining who had personal memories of the Richardsons. The memorial garden had been redesigned during a park renovation, though a small plaque acknowledging its original purpose remained, a modest marker of a tragedy that had once defined the community. The FBI officially closed the Richardson-Harmon case file after Donovan's confession, marking the end of an investigation that had spanned more than 2 decades. The final report concluded, "This case represents an extraordinary example of identity manipulation, long-term criminal conspiracy, and the unforeseen human consequences when fabricated lives intersect with genuine emotion. The lessons learned have informed significant changes in financial fraud investigation, identity verification protocols, and behavioral analysis techniques." Perhaps the most profound epilogue came through the academic work of Dr. Rachel Foster, a researcher who had studied the case extensively and interviewed everyone connected to it over 15 years. Her book, Constructed Selves, Identity and Deception in the Digital Age, used the Richardson case as its central framework for examining broader questions about authenticity in contemporary life. What made this case so compelling wasn't just the elaborate fraud or the tragic ending, Dr. Foster wrote in her conclusion. It was how it challenged our fundamental assumptions about identity and intimacy. Michael Harmon began by creating Thomas Richardson as a fiction, but gradually inhabited the role so completely that the boundaries blurred. His feelings for Elaine appear to have been the most authentic aspect of an otherwise manufactured existence. She added, "In an age where all of us curate our public personas and reveal ourselves selectively, the Richardson case raises uncomfortable questions about the nature of the self. Are we simply the accumulation of our actions and choices, or is there some core identity that remains consistent beneath our various performances? And perhaps most unsettling, how can we truly know another person when aspects of ourselves remain unknowable even to us?" 20 years after the deaths that had captivated the nation's attention, these philosophical questions outlived the sensational details of the case itself. The story of Thomas and Elaine Richardson, or rather of Michael Harmon and the woman who unwittingly married a fiction, had evolved from true crime sensation to cultural touchstone, a reference point in ongoing conversations about identity, deception, and the foundations of human connection in an increasingly complex world. As Dr. Foster observed in her final analysis, the most enduring legacy of this case may be how it illuminates the delicate balance between performance and authenticity in all our relationships. Not because we're all engaged in deliberate deception like Harmon, but because we all navigate the gap between our internal selves and how we're perceived by others. The tragedy on Sycamore Drive was extreme in its circumstances, but universal in its underlying tensions, a dark mirror reflecting aspects of the human condition we might prefer not to recognize. 25 years after the deaths on Sycamore Drive, a remarkable discovery fundamentally transformed understanding of the Richardson case. Construction workers demolishing an abandoned storage facility in Camden discovered a climate-controlled vault concealed behind a false wall. Inside was an extensive archive that Maxwell Donovan had maintained as an insurance policy, one that had remained hidden after his death 3 years earlier. The vault contained meticulously organized records spanning 30 years, audio recordings, videos, financial documents, photographs, and personal journals that chronicled the full extent of the criminal enterprise Donovan had built. Most significantly, it included hundreds of hours of secretly recorded conversations between Donovan and Harmon that revealed dimensions of their relationship never previously suspected. The Donovan Archive, as it came to be known, painted a picture of a criminal partnership far more complex and extensive than investigators had imagined. Their collaboration had begun not in Sacramento, but 15 years earlier, when Donovan, then working as a private investigator for a San Francisco law firm, had identified Michael Harmon, still living under his birth name of Kevin Pearson, as a potential asset. "Found an ideal candidate today," read Donovan's journal entry from 1983. "Junior financial analyst with the ethical flexibility and intelligence I've been searching for. Conducted preliminary assessment, scored high on manipulation metrics, low on empathy and risk aversion, perfect for long-term deployment." The recordings revealed that Donovan had carefully cultivated Harmon, initially hiring him for special projects that gradually escalated in both financial reward and criminal sophistication. Their relationship had evolved from mentor-protégé to equal partners, with Donovan providing the strategic framework and Harmon the charismatic front. "Think of yourself as an actor in the world's most lucrative theater production," Donovan could be heard telling Harmon in a recording from 1986. "The stage is the financial sector, the audience is potential marks, and I'm your director. Follow the script, improvise when necessary, but remember who's producing this show." The Sacramento fraud, previously understood as Harmon's independent operation, was revealed to be merely one production in an extensive portfolio of schemes, orchestrated by Donovan across multiple states and spanning decades. The records documented frauds in 12 cities, utilizing 8 different identities for Harmon, and resulting in estimated collective losses of over $50 million, 10 times the amount previously attributed to their activities. Most disturbingly, the archive contained evidence of crimes far more serious than fraud. Photographs, location data, and audio recordings suggested Donovan had arranged the removal of at least 3 individuals who had threatened to expose their operations between 1992 and 2001. These deaths, previously ruled accidents or suicides, were now being reinvestigated as potential homicides. "Sometimes pruning is necessary for the health of the overall enterprise," Donovan could be heard saying in one recording after the suspicious boating accident of a former associate. "Your discomfort with necessary measures is becoming problematic. Michael, evolution requires adaptation." For investigators, the most revelatory aspect of the archive concerned the Richardson identity itself. Contrary to both men's previous claims, Thomas Richardson had not been created for Harmon's benefit at all. The identity had been developed by Donovan as his own exit strategy, complete with background documentation, financial infrastructure, and the property in Millfield. "The Richardson identity is my masterpiece," Donovan recorded in a private audio journal in 1999. 17 years in development, every detail meticulously crafted and aged. "When the time comes, Thomas Richardson will simply emerge fully formed, with a history so seamless that even the most determined investigation will find nothing suspicious." A handwritten journal from 2002 documented Donovan's fury when Harmon, fleeing the Sacramento indictment, leveraged his knowledge of Donovan's criminal activities to essentially blackmail him into surrendering the Richardson identity. "He's stolen my retirement, my life's work appropriated with casual entitlement. This betrayal will not stand uncorrected." The most significant revelations concerned the relationship with Elaine and the events leading to the deaths. Email exchanges between Donovan and Harmon documented growing tension as Harmon began to genuinely invest in his life as Thomas Richardson. "Your performance as a devoted husband has become concerning," Donovan wrote in 2015. "You're forgetting the fundamental nature of this arrangement. He is not your wife in any meaningful sense. She's a prop in an elaborate production. Your attachment represents an unacceptable vulnerability." Harmon's reply was equally telling. Perhaps after 15 years, the distinction between performance and reality becomes academic. Whether my feelings originated in calculation or developed organically, they now exist. Attachment may be a vulnerability, but it also provides surprisingly effective cover. People see what they expect to see. A devoted husband rarely registers as a potential fraud. The archive documented Donovan's growing concern as Harmon began making financial moves independent of their partnership, establishing separate accounts, liquidating certain assets, and most alarmingly, exploring legitimate investment opportunities for funds that had previously been committed to their joint ventures. He's attempting to construct a genuine life from materials intended for temporary shelter, Donovan recorded privately in 2022. This was always the risk, that the role would consume the actor. Contingency planning has become necessary. A series of audio files recorded in the week before the deaths provided the clearest picture yet of what had actually transpired. Donovan had deliberately engineered the discovery of Harmon's true identity, not by placing the lockbox for Elaine to find, as he had claimed in his confession, but through an anonymous tip to an investigative journalist who had been looking into cold fraud cases. "The dominoes are in place," he recorded on April 14, 2023. "When they fall, he'll have no choice but to execute emergency protocols, which will bring assets back under shared control. He may resent the disruption initially, but he'll recognize the necessity once the performance becomes untenable." What Donovan hadn't anticipated was Harmon's reaction when Elaine discovered his true identity. A recorded phone call from April 16th captured Harmon in a state of emotional distress entirely inconsistent with his previously calculated demeanor. "She knows everything, Max," Harmon said, his voice unsteady. "Not just about Sacramento, but Denver, Phoenix. She's been researching all night. I expected recrimination, but it's worse. She's looking at me with pity, like I'm some broken thing she needs to fix or report. I can't lose her, but I don't see a path forward that preserves both her and my freedom." Donovan's response was cold. "Your attachment has compromised your judgment. The contingency protocols are clear: clean extraction, complete dissociation. Sentimentality at this juncture is not just unnecessary, but actively dangerous." The most crucial recording was made on April 18th, the day of the deaths. Donovan's body camera, which he apparently routinely wore during sensitive operations, captured the entire final confrontation in the Richardson home. The footage, which ran for 47 minutes, definitively resolved questions that had persisted for 25 years. It showed Harmon and Elaine in the midst of intense discussion when Donovan arrived. Contrary to his confession, he had come uninvited, carrying a pistol and a small bag, later determined to contain cash and transportation documents. "This situation has become untenable," Donovan announced upon entering. "The exposure risk extends beyond acceptable parameters. I've arranged extraction for this evening. Private airfield, no documentation. Michael comes with me. You, Mrs. Richardson, will be detained temporarily to prevent immediate reporting." The footage showed Elaine's calm defiance. "I've already spoken with authorities. Time-delayed emails will send documentation to multiple recipients if I don't input a cancellation code by midnight. You've lost, Mr. Donovan. The only question is whether you both face consequences or try to find some measure of redemption." What followed was 20 minutes of increasingly tense negotiation, with Harmon positioned physically between Donovan and Elaine. As Donovan became more agitated, Harmon made a pivotal declaration. "I'm staying with Elaine. Whatever comes next, we face it together. Our partnership is terminated, Max. Leave now while you still can. The footage showed Donovan raising his weapon, Harmon lunging forward to protect Elaine, and 2 shots fired in rapid succession. The camera captured Harmon falling first, a wound to his chest clearly visible, followed by Elaine rushing to his side, only to be shot as well. The final minutes showed Donovan methodically arranging the scene, placing the weapon in Harmon's hand and manipulating the positions of the bodies inside the vehicle. His final words, spoken directly to the camera, before removing it, were chilling in their detachment. Necessary resolution to asset compromise. Official narrative established. Murder-suicide, resulting from identity exposure. Case closure anticipated within standard parameters. The discovery of the Donovan archive, and particularly the footage of the final confrontation, sent shockwaves through law enforcement and the public consciousness. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit conducted an extensive review of all materials, producing a comprehensive reassessment of both Donovan and Harmon. While neither man can be characterized as anything but a sophisticated predator, the evidence suggests a significant divergence in their trajectories, the report concluded. Donovan maintained consistent sociopathic patterns throughout his criminal career, viewing people exclusively as assets or obstacles. Harmon, surprisingly, appears to have experienced genuine psychological evolution during his years as Thomas Richardson, developing authentic attachment capacities that ultimately contributed to his death. For Marissa Harmon, now in her 50s and a leading researcher in criminal psychology, the archive provided painful but clarifying insights into her biological father. The man revealed in these recordings is still a criminal who caused immense harm, she acknowledged. But the evidence that he died trying to protect someone he genuinely loved, that's significant. Not redemptive, perhaps, but suggestive of the human capacity for change, even in the most unlikely circumstances. The victims of the original Sacramento fraud, most now deceased or in their final years, received additional restitution from assets identified through Donovan's records. The total recovery ultimately exceeded their original losses, a rare outcome in white-collar crime cases of such age and complexity. Catherine Atherton Wells, approaching 80 and the last living child of Harmon's earliest known victims, expressed complex feelings about the revelations. Learning that my father's death was part of a much larger criminal enterprise doesn't lessen the personal loss, she reflected. But there's a certain validation in knowing the full truth, that the man responsible actually paid with his life, however circuitously that justice arrived. For the academic and legal communities, the Donovan Archive became an unprecedented resource for understanding long-term criminal partnerships, identity fraud, and the psychology of deception. Harvard Law School established the Richardson-Donovan Center for White-Collar Crime Studies, dedicated to analyzing the materials and developing enhanced prevention and detection methodologies. Dr. Simone Harper, whose earlier work on the case had gained renewed attention, published a final analysis that captured the broader significance. What makes this case so extraordinary isn't just the elaborate fraud or even the unexpected emotional evolution. It's how it forces us to confront the malleability of identity itself, how roles adopted for instrumental purposes can gradually transform the actor, sometimes in ways that undermine the original deception. She added, "In Harmon, we see the rare case of someone who began by wearing a mask and gradually grew into it, so completely that when forced to choose between the performance and self-preservation, he chose the performance. The final footage shows a man who started as Kevin Pearson, became Michael Harmon, transformed into Thomas Richardson, and died as something perhaps beyond any of those constructions, someone capable of sacrificing himself for another. The residents of Millfield where the tragedy had unfolded 25 years earlier, reacted to the new revelations with a mixture of fascination and fatigue. For most current residents, the Richardson case was ancient history, a local legend more than a lived experience. The memorial garden remained, though few visitors understood its specific origin. Sarah Dominguez, one of the few neighbors still living on Sycamore Drive from that time, offered perhaps the most poignant reflection when interviewed for a documentary. Marking the 25th anniversary, I think about the Thomas and Elaine I knew, the neighbors who brought soup when I was sick, who helped during snowstorms, who seemed to genuinely care for each other. Knowing the full truth now, I still believe those moments weren't entirely fraudulent. There was something real there, however it began. In the end, perhaps the most fitting conclusion came from Elaine herself, through a passage in her journal discovered after Donovan's confession. We all wear masks of one kind or another. We present different versions of ourselves in different contexts, with colleagues, friends, lovers, strangers. The question isn't whether we're performing, but whether the performance serves truth or deception. Thomas has always been somewhat enigmatic, with parts of himself kept carefully reserved. I've accepted this as his nature, though sometimes I wonder about the spaces between what's shown and what's hidden. Perhaps that mystery is part of what sustains love over time, the recognition that we can spend decades with someone and still discover new facets, still be surprised by depths previously uncharted. Those words, written before she had any inkling of her husband's true identity, captured the universal tension between performance and authenticity that made the Richardson case so compelling. In its final assessment, it stood not merely as a sensational true crime narrative, but as a profound meditation on identity, intimacy, and the blurred boundaries between the roles we play and the selves we become, a mirror reflecting questions that extend far beyond the specific tragedy on Sycamore Drive. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.